morning. Is the video ready? Okay. Good morning. This morning's e-Pedigree subcommittee or committee meeting, and I'm just going to get over some housekeeping stuff. And this committee meeting is open to the public and is accessible to the physically disabled. A person who needs disability-related accommodation or modification in order to participate in the meeting may make a request by contacting Laura Hendricks at 916-574-7918 or by emailing Laura at Hendricks, HENDRICKS at dca.ca.gov, or sending a written request to Ms. Hendricks at the Board of Pharmacy, 1625 North Market Boulevard, Suite N219, Sacramento, California, 95834. Providing your request at least 5 business days before the meeting will help to ensure availability of the requested accommodation. And also, yet pharmacists and pharmacy technicians who attend the full committee meeting can be awarded 2 hours of CE in accordance to the board's CE policy. A maximum of 4 CE hours can be earned each year by attending the meeting of 2 different committee board meetings. C. With that, I guess we'll take a roll call to establish
Rosalind Hackworth, public member.
Randy Kajoka, a professional member.
Stan Weiser, professional member.
Okay, is that enough for quorum? If we need to vote on anything?
You're only making recommendations, so
we can make a recommendation if so needed. At that, we're going to start out with projected e-Pedigree dates. Going to be September 26th and December 10th. September 26th is looking in
Los Angeles,
and then December 10th, possibly the Bay Area. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Next item will be a presentation by TechNarts regarding the operation and technical parameters of Turkey sterilized tracking system for prescription medication. Is that representative for TechNarts here?
They're coming in from Turkey via Skype, and I believe they're online. For those of you in the audience, this is just an announcement. We are webcasting today so that when you come up to speak, we're going to ask you to come to the front table to speak, announce your name, but recognize that you're being webcast. International fame. So, are you ready? You want to introduce them?
I don't see. That's Taha Yaycı. Yaycı will provide an overview of the requirements of the Turkey systems and how the system has operated. And so, if
Mr. Yaycı, are you on the phone? Victor? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me also?
Yes. Thank you for calling in. You have a very captive audience waiting to hear your wisdom. And you may proceed at any time.
I can barely hear you.
Victor, I think he can only hear you probably, so why don't you tell him to go ahead.
Please start.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to present ITS in this meeting. Now I'm ready. I'm sorry not being there with you face to face, but I will try to do my best to point out what we did and how we did it. The thing that we will talk is not just about counterfeit. In fact, it's about murder, because the problems that we all encounter now cause some deaths. So I want to start by telling you a saying in Turkey to emphasize our aims while starting that project. Let people live so the state would live. Our aim was to let people live. You are familiar this is nothing more than a problem-solving loop. First, I will define the problem and tell you what the situation in Turkey was. Then I will tell you the solution and define it. After that, we will talk about how we implemented it, and at the end, I will give you some statistics about the system and talk about the outcomes. The main problem is, in fact, was to ensure and guarantee the reliable supply of drugs to the patients. The secondary problems that we faced was preventing the sale of illegal drugs, smuggled drugs, illegal sale of drugs, barcode scams, and of course, by using this valuable data, support rational use of medicines. And we reached a result at the end that includes all of them, moreover, not limited to these. All stakeholders have licenses from Medicines and Medical Devices Agency in Turkey, and also all drugs are getting registered to the system of the agency after getting the permission from the scientific committee. The price of a drug is also defined by the agency, and 91% of the drugs are paid by the Reimbursement Association of the state. By knowing all this, you may conclude that the biggest customer of the industry is the state. The rest is very likely to other countries. A manufacturer manufactures a drug and sells it to a wholesaler. And if the wholesaler sells these drugs to a drug consuming center, such as hospitals, family physicians, polyclinics, in other words, the stakeholders that don't sell the drug to the patient, just uses the drug on the patient. The wholesaler acts as a tender and sells drugs in big amounts. But if the wholesaler sells the drugs to a retail pharmacy, which in Turkey should be managed by a pharmacist, then the wholesaler sells the drugs by small amounts, but in high frequencies. The drug consuming centers are clearly opens the drug pack and uses every tablet on a different patient, but don't sell the drug. The retail pharmacies, on the other side, sell the drug pack to the end user and rarely get the price in cash, but mostly send the invoice to the Reimbursement Association or an insurance company maybe, if the patient has a private insurance, and paid by the reimbursement entity. So, to the structure of Turkey, let's talk about the solution. Traceability, as all you know, the traceability is defined as track, trace, authentication, pedigree, returns, and recalls. So the solution is ITS, which is word-by-word translation of pharmaceutical track and trace system in Turkish. Formerly, all drug packs in Turkey was containing GS1 GTIN, which is Global Trade Item Number, and barcode to make it machine readable. In ITS, we first made the drug packs to be serialized by a serial number, which is a GS1 standard, and marked them with another GS1 standard data matrix to make it machine readable. Then we constructed a centralized repository to make all the stakeholders to notify the central management system about every action that they take on the drug pack. So ITS doesn't have any interface, but doesn't have any interface that's designed for the stakeholder. It has some rich points named as web services that can be used by the software applications that stakeholders use. All stakeholders are using their own management systems, and those management systems have interfaces for the use of the stakeholder, and in the background, the management system communicates with ITS to notify about the action taken on the drug pack. In this manner, ITS can track and trace a drug by using its serial number from the point of manufacture and to the point of dispense. With this way, it's for sure that ITS is a fully interoperable, electronic, unit-level serialization-based track and trace system for pharmaceuticals. As a result, we changed the situation of the pharmaceutical sector from being a high-profit, low-risk sector for criminals to a high risk low profit. So, you know, criminals are still criminals, but they move to other sectors such as tobacco, food supplements, or other stuff. Now, in Turkey, in other sectors also. Let me tell you the situation in Turkey after ITS. This slide is the main slide of my presentation. So, first, we have ITS that you can see on the bottom of the screen. ITS is a centralized repository for serialized pharmaceuticals, and we have PTS on the top of the screen, a centralized file sharing platform. PTS is named as Package Transfer Service. In ITS, we are tracking and tracing the drugs by individual packs. In other words, ITS is working on the basis of drug packs. But the real trade doesn't go that way. Real trade is going by cartoons, boxes, pallets, and so on. So we created a new standard of language that can be used between stakeholders to share the hierarchical data that containers include, and named it as PTS XML standard. First stakeholder who is making a container is creating an XML file, information of which container includes which drug packs, and uploads this XML file to PTS. After the physical transaction is done, the second stakeholder downloads the XML file from PTS and learns the hierarchy of the container. Then resamples some of the drug packs in the container to verify the XML file data is correct, and uses the data of drug packs in the XML file to notify the action to ITS. After telling you ITS and PTS, let's have a look at the workflow. Yes. A manufacturer manufactures a drug pack and sends a manufacturer notification to ITS, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. This is the birth record of the drug pack. Then, after an order comes from a wholesaler, the manufacturer sends the sale notification to ITS for the drug packs that he will deliver, and creates an XML file containing the container hierarchy and uploads it to PTS. After the shipment is done and delivered to the wholesaler first downloads the XML file from PTS and uses the drug pack information in XML file to notify ITS about the purchase action. After the wholesaler sends the purchase notification to ITS, the ownership of the drug changes. A retail pharmacy or a drug consumer center sends an order to the wholesaler. The wholesaler sends the sale notification to ITS and uploads the XML file to PTS, as the manufacturer did. And he sends the drugs to the corresponding stakeholder, the retail pharmacy or the drug consuming center, downloads the XML file from PTS and uses the information of drug packs to notify the purchase action to ITS. For the drug consuming centers, the consume notification is done right before opening the drug pack and of the drug system, and the system prevents this drug to be used twice. But for the retail pharmacy, after getting the prescription from the patient, he sells the drug pack to the patient and sends the invoice to the reimbursement company or the association. Then the reimbursement association queries the sale from ITS and verifies if all the information that the retail pharmacy sent are correct before paying the price to the retail pharmacy. Then he pays the price and the cycle ends. So, phases, we implemented the solution in 3 phases. First phase was the preliminary phase, including workshops with the industry, defining standards, making the legislation, and defining the timeline. The second phase is named as phase 1, which is including meeting the technology standards for serialization and printing data matrix on the drug pack, and consequently, in this phase, manufacturer notification of manufacturers and sale notification of pharmacies was obligatory. And the reimbursement association was querying the sale before paying the price to the pharmacies, of course. In the third and phase, phase 2, the aggregation is done. By different words, all notifications are obligatory for all stakeholders. It's full track and trace. And as the government, the monitoring and support decision systems are developed, of course. Let's look at some statistics of the system, which is working for over 3 years. As you can see, we have more than 40,000 stakeholders included in the system. We tracked and traced more than 6.5 billion drug packs by ITS. And nearly 4 billion of them are sold. For the technical people who are curious, our response time is 0.03 seconds. In other words, it's 30 milliseconds. And our uptime ratio is 99.999%, which is over Tier 4 standard. And all the updated data can be at our website, that's its.go.tr, and you can reach them publicly. Our main objective was to ensure the reliable supply of drugs to the patients. But we achieved more, that you can see. We prevented the sale of counterfeit and smuggled drugs, prevented illegal sale of drugs, barcode scams, drug thefts. These 5 issues give us a saving of $1 billion. Let me say it again, it's $1 billion savings annually. By considering that pharmaceutical industry is $10 billion in Turkey, the saving has a significant effect. And also, we removed some of the bureaucratic things that saved our time. And the system gave us some instruments to support the fight against narcotics and black market. We can do more complex recalls, and they can be instantly applied. We can recall, for example, we can recall a batch or a half batch of a drug from just some type of stakeholders, and we can do the recall way, such as stopping the sale or efforts in supply chain. And at the time we enter this recall to the system, it starts instantly, and no one can treat against the rule. Also, the data is valuable. We can use this data to support rational use of medicines, create administrative reports, monitor the industry, or we can use this data to prevent tax fraud also. Faster decisions and more consistent estimations can be also made by using this instantly updated data. So you can learn all the details and updated statistics from our website, as I said before, its.go.tr, and our cell phones and emails are always open to any questions that you can ask. And thank you for listening to me. And also I'm open to any question that's coming from you now. Can you hear me? Is there anyone?
Talking to the microphone, maybe that'll help. Or the phone, I don't know how you've got the connection.
Yes, I can hear Victor. Yes. First 3 years from 2005 to 2009, we tried to convince the politicians. So it took about 3 years to convince them, and 1 year simultaneously took for the legislations and the development of the central management system, and 1 year for phase 1 for the manufacturers to be ready for the aggregation and the wholesalers to be ready with respect to the technology. It took about for the development phase, and after 3 years it's consistent, and we started in January 2010. It's more than 3 years, I think, now, and the system is consistently working for 3 years.
Question to Randy, and then he can rephrase. So do they use inference much and to what degree?
I want to know if you use inference much and to what degree.
Can you?
Because our regulations is the smallest sellable unit, which may be a bottle of 100, but it may be shipped in a case or a pallet. So there's inferences on the table to infer that the pallet or the case says what the bottle is inside that. Do you use inference, or is each sellable unit scanned into the system for verification or validation?
Are you able to give a question?
No, I'm sorry.
Just a second.
I can hear just the minimum saleable unit.
We have sellable, or
Yes.
the pedigree goes into the smallest sellable unit, but
Yes.
to ease the process through the supply chain, there is inference that could be implemented, and the inference would be that bottle, that smallest sellable bottle could be packed in a case, which then may be packed in a pallet. So instead of breaking down each pallet, each case to scan that sellable unit, inference is in place. Do you use inference in your system as well?
Yeah, of course. That's the biggest point. That's the biggest problem of phase 2. In one of my slides, I said that PTS, package transfer service, and that secondary application solved our problem, because ITS is working for each drug pack, each minimum saleable unit, the smallest saleable unit. But PTS is containing the hierarchical data of which container contains which drug packs. So between the stakeholders, there is a system named PTS to share that hierarchical XML file between the stakeholders. So the aggregation part is really hard. I mean, was really hard for us. But after implementing PTS, we solved all of our problems. I can give you an example like this. The wholesalers are grading the manufacturers in Turkey. For example, for the manufacturer X, if manufacturer X is working based on a good standard, then the wholesaler just opens the case, opens the pallet, and 1 or 2 boxes if the manufacturer X has a quality of service. If manufacturer Y doesn't have a quality of service and often makes mistakes, then his grade is low. Wholesaler, when the wholesaler gets a package from manufacturer Y, he opens all the package and scans all the boxes with his own will, because the system is not deciding on behalf of the stakeholder. Stakeholder decides what to do with his own will. Is that an answer for your question?
Yeah, thank you. Because we have in our language what we call a trusted partnership or trusted relationship, which basically is what you
Yeah. Yes.
AB-rated partners. So thank you.
Yeah.
It does address the fact that there could be some areas where it's not so tight, and that's why inference is checked, periodically. Do we have another question? We have a public board meeting in July 30th and 31st, which is our full board.
Yes.
And I wasn't
Yes.
sure if you would be able to make it to the States to give this fine presentation. But the offer's out there for you, and hopefully you could make it. But I guess Ginny would be the contact person or her staff to see if that could happen.
I hope so.
Any other board
I hope
questions?
so.
Yes, sir.
I would like to be with you in California now, but this morning, about 10 hours later, we have a flight to Switzerland, Basel. So it's really hard for me to come to California for a half an hour and come back to Basel. So please take my apologies, and I will try to be in your next meeting.
It was wishful thinking on our part.
Or we can go there.
Maybe we'll move the board over
That's
to you.
out-of-state travel. It's a little hard. Out-of-country travel is a little harder to get, we would think.
Is there any other board questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I want to know, if they have the stat showing the number, or the man hours it took from, I guess, was there any increase in man hours with this program once it was implemented?
Okay, what
Like
board
on the wholesale.
The board member asked, did you, and I'm paraphrasing, did you or did the industry complain of any increase of manpower and implementation of this process? And how extensive was it?
Of course. In the first stage, in the preliminary phase, they really fought and resisted to our decisions. But we made a lot of workshops with them, and we listened to them, and in every meeting we created new of ITS to them. After implementing such a system, every manufacturer is happy, because we can prevent the counterfeit nationally, and also they can find out the frauds in their own companies, and they can catch the criminals in their own companies. So it's really beneficial to everybody. First, it's starting with believing. So they believe that the system is also beneficial for them. We convince them that it's beneficial. Then they make the investment, and now the investment they get back the investment that they did, I think.
Thank you. Any other board questions?
Maybe I can add something. Maybe you didn't ask, but I can add something. I cannot give you the cost of the system because it's confidential by the government, but I can give you the return of investment. Do you know what return of investment is?
Yes. Oh, I don't know what yours is. That would be very interesting. I'm sure our business partners would love to hear that as well.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. The return of investment of the system is 18 hours. Not years, not months. It's 18 hours. The cost of the system is by the country in hours.
Was that realized by the companies seeing an increase in sales because of the decrease of fraudulent product?
See the increase of sale, but their productivity and efficiency is improved.
Thank you. Very interesting.
And the fraud in the sector decreased. In the companies are decreased.
We have another question from our executive officer.
You're going to have to you're going to have to waylay it. This is for the webcast, and then you're going to have to relay it to Taha, okay? We are hearing that some companies will not be ready to meet the January 1, 2015 deadline, which means they won't be able to sell their product in California. In Turkey, were there companies that had to forego selling drugs in Turkey because they were not ready? And if so, what was the effect on public health?
The question we have is that
Yes.
California has a deadline that needs to be met for the pedigree process, and we're
Yes,
hearing from
2015.
that they were having some concerns from the manufacturers that they will not be able to make that deadline. So the question we have for you is, if you run into the same type of problems where manufacturers were not able to make your deadline, and if so, what kind of impact did it have on public health in Turkey?
We faced bigger problems because in the beginning stage, technology was not improved enough. So there were no HD cameras. There were no packaging lines that can print data matrices. So we faced bigger problems. And they said, I mean, the manufacturers and also other type of stakeholders resisted to start at the beginning of the 2010. But our minister decided to start on the first day of January of 2010. So, you know, I said that the biggest customer of the industry is the state itself in Turkey. So the biggest customer rules, you know. They had to obey the rule. So in the first 6 months, it was really a mess. Really, the health service, I mean, slowed down, and sometimes we faced some big problems, but we always come together with the manufacturers, help them to get the improved technology, and in 6 months we solved all of our problems. So I can say that the starting date of ITS is 1st of January 2010, but the real starting date is 27th of May of 2010. So if you change something in the strategy, then the manufacturers should invest on a new technology, and that technology, I mean that technology, to develop that technology, it will take more time. But in our system, the technology is enough, and the standards, the documents, the legislations are consistent and finished. So we can share everything with you to make you not to lose any time, like us.
Thank you.
And also one more thing. You are really very welcome. Be in Turkey. You can see how the system works by your own eyes, and I will be glad to see you all in Turkey, and I can organize a journey to site visits for manufacturers, wholesalers, and pharmacies maybe, and hospitals, and also I can give you a full presentation in Turkey maybe.
That would be awesome if we're able to do that. I think our business partners have a better chance of that than we do. With that, any more board questions? Then I'll open up to the public. Any public questions? Please come up here. Any? I guess your presentation was very eye-opening for us as well as the industry here. We'd love to hear more, so keep in contact. Thank you for taking the time.
Okay.
We have using technology at its best right now. So
Okay.
with that, I think we're just very appreciative of your presentation, and thank you very much.
I thank you very much. We're nice meeting. I have to go to another meeting, but my colleague is here for any other question that you can ask.
Thank you again. We'll keep in contact.
Tour?
Might be still on the line. Did we sign them off? Okay. Thank you. That was very impressive. Thanks for arranging that presentation. Go on number 3. Discussions regarding comments submitted by the Board of Pharmacy in response to the federal legislation in April of 2013. That's going to be on attachment A. And basically in April, there's different version of the federal legislation is provided to provide supply chain security was introduced to both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In May, the House passed its version. In the Senate Health Committee has passed its bill, but the full Senate has not voted on this matter yet. Is there any update on that?
No, as far as we've been told, it will be next in line or relatively next in line behind immigration reform, which is supposed to be voted on this week. The border security amendment is supposed to be voted on today, and then the rest of it's supposed to be voted on later this week. So that may put the track and trace bill that's combined now with the compounding bill up for next week, but it's the Senate, so who knows?
A copy of that letter is, like I said, in attachment A.
I'd just like to mention that there was another letter sent by the board president that was sent to the House regarding that House bill that's not included in the packet. I don't. It wasn't in what I printed out. I don't know if did the board members see that letter in their packet?
I think there's only one letter.
Yeah. So that may have been omitted. Anyway, there was a letter that was sent to the House side expressing the board's general opposition to the House bill in preference for the Senate bill.
I guess there's a couple of key points in our letter. One is that there was some reservation in our support, and that was contingent upon some of the items that we felt did not protect the Californians to the degree we wanted our bill to do. There was strong support of the idea of having a multidisciplinary group, having one legislation that covers 50 states, so there wasn't a bunch of just small variances. And part of the other statements was that we were strongly believe that strengthening the supply chain requirements of pedigree, not only does it protect the people of California, but by its adherence, it would protect the people of the nation. And this, we kind of reiterated that this law has been in effect since 2004. The implementation date of 2015 to 2017 was kind of discouraged by the fact that the federal law would increase it out another 10 years plus. So there was some concern about that. And we also noted that the FDA has repeatedly expressed that participation by all industry partners. And we were concerned that the proposal does not adequately specify or require automatic validation to transaction data from the trading partners. Is there any other key points on that letter? Any? You want?
The only other main point that I think you didn't cover that's sort of separate from the pedigree or track and trace piece is that the board expressed support for the modifications that were made to this draft from prior drafts with regard to the national wholesale licensure standards and the third-party logistics provider wholesaler standards, because the Senate bill sets a floor but not a ceiling for regulation of those entities by states. such that states like California could still have additional requirements and provisions on top of those.
There was some points in which they talked about the licensing, and we felt strongly that the state or federal should still continue to license entities, whether it's a reverse wholesalers or and then there were some things about disposition of illegitimate product that it should be retained for future investigation instead of just destroyed.
Right. I mean, there were letters sent by the board back, particularly the November 7, 2012 letter, that were much longer and more detailed and specified lots of particular points that the board thought ought to be improved in the legislation moving through the Senate. This letter repeated some of those points, but not all of them, and just incorporated that longer letter by reference. Some of them include things like how suspect product and illegitimate product are defined for purposes of investigation and interdiction, or like the points you mentioned about how the samples of those drugs will be retained if suspect products are intercepted for later investigation. Little points like that. But you covered all the main sort of scope or concept kind of points that were made in the letter.
I would just add, if you don't mind, Randy, that on page 2 of the letter, beginning at the top of the page, we mention our reserve support, and then as the going down to the general comments on the DDS draft, those 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs really express our feelings about what enthusiasm we might or might not have regarding where the federal legislation was going. And as you look at section number 3 on page 6 of 8, and that again speaks about the timeline that you mentioned in paragraph number 2, section number 3, and we talk about the automatic verification at the unit level, et cetera. And then lastly, on page number 7 of 8, the conclusion that we came to regarding the situation, and I mean, so anyway, I would encourage anybody that has a few moments to read the entire letter. If not, highlight it.
Yeah. Because there is some detailed, like questions about definition, question on it should be at the dispensing level. There was some question on, who should be the reporters, if, anywhere down the chain, should they report a discrepancy? Have those being integrated into the new versions or as the federal law? So it's just kind of, we identified them, but there's just no response on it.
Well, I wouldn't say none of them have been. There have been some small changes made between the draft on which this comment was submitted and the version that was passed out of the Senate Help Committee, and some of those were responsive to these comments. But it's not possible to say how many of them were at this point, given the constraints of time. But there were a few things that were changed. For instance, that question of sampling, retaining samples of drug products that are believed or confirmed to be illegitimate. There was some clarifying language added to make that more mandatory, that when you are, before you dispose of or destroy a product, that you at least offer the regulatory agencies the opportunity that you will retain a sample for testing.
Okay. Any other comments from the board regarding the letter or for the committee?
I'd just like to add that we'll put the additional, there is actually an attachment to this letter, and there is a letter that was sent to the House. So we will put those in supplemental materials for this meeting on our website because they should have been in the packet. So I'm sorry they weren't there.
Do we have any comments from the public?
Sorry. John Valencia, representing a variety of pharmaceutical manufacturers affected by the interpretation of the effect of federal legislation. I don't know that it is premature yet to consider this analysis, but Mr. Room mentioned that certain of the legislative elements at the federal level might set what you would regard as a floor and not a ceiling. But I take you back to the roots of SB 1307 and the wide-ranging in operation or effective in operation on state law that any federal enactment that's successful and that's signed by the president would have on state legislation. So I guess the question I have really is that we're not talking about board-level activity to take advantage of an open ceiling, but rather the need to go back to the legislature and find new authority for that. Would that be correct?
Well, there were about 3 different questions in what you said, so I'll answer them in sequence.
Okay.
The first question that I heard in what you said was, does the federal legislation have a preemptive effect on California law? And either version of the bill, as written in either the House or the Senate, has explicit preemption language on certain subject areas, one of those being anything related to serialization or track and trace, another being, and this is where the bills differ, is on the national wholesale licensure standards. The House bill specifically preempts any additional state regulation of those entities. The Senate bill sets a floor but allows states to have additional requirements. So on that particular issue, there is not complete preemption in the Senate bill, at least. And within those parameters, and this is what I understand to be your second question, would the board have authority to take additional measures? No, the board would need additional legislation, except that some of the board's existing legislation is already supplemental to what the federal legislation would require, so those laws would not be preempted in terms of like the wholesaler bond, things like that, that may be, because the federal legislation requires only one bond essentially nationally. California has a bond requirement specific to California, so that may be a supplemental requirement, in other words. So there are pieces that are already in place that would not be preempted and would be additional to what the federal government requires, but anything beyond what's in current law would have to go back to the legislature.
Thanks very much for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Any other comments from the public? Seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 4, which is the update on the status of pending California regulations on the requirements for serialized numeric identifiers, reporting on the 50% of products serialized by January 2015, and which is remaining at 2016, and grandfathering. And that's going to be on attachment B. And I guess this has been presented multiple times, so I don't know if there's any questions from the board on there, or Josh, you have any updates on that? It's been pretty, our comments been out there, it's been on for comments for quite some length, and I don't think there's been really too many comments regarding these items. I guess maybe on at one point there was grandfathering was, and what the 50% was, but nothing of...
No, we continue to receive, and Ginny and I have, Ginny more than I, but both of us have participated in webinars and other educational pieces with the industry, and we have continued to receive questions on application of these regulations, or of the general underlying requirement that manufacturers submit these identifications of their 50% stock and things like that. And so there are clarifying questions that are being asked, but I don't believe there's any questions that pertain to the regulatory language or to clarifying that language, or that would prevent those regulations from moving forward.
You have to ask?
I was deciding to be formal this time. I'm behaving myself so far. The regulation itself, the board's completed its work on it, and the board had their comments. We collected information at the front end. We developed language. We released it for comment. We had a hearing. We finalized the regulation. Right now it's going through the required administrative review process, and it's been undergoing review since the beginning of April. for the most part. It is not yet gone to the Office of Administrative Law. We're still waiting for the another administrative agency to finish the review. They review it for specific components, but not for overall policy, so that we believe that it will be completed through that process relatively soon, and that the regulation file will be moved to the Office of Administrative Law, which is the last entity to review it, which they have then the equivalent of 6 weeks to review it. They have 30 working days, at which point the regulation will either be approved or disapproved, and if it's disapproved, the board will have to figure out what it's going to do with it, because generally it would be some procedural thing that we would have to fix, we believe. We're not quite sure, but that's what we would assume. But for all intents and purposes, the board's intent with respect to grandfathering and the use of the serialized number and then the drugs that remain in the supply chain after implementation, those particular provisions are laid out in the regulation for the profession to understand where the board's going. So part of the reason we have it out there is so that people can continue to see what the general requirement is.
Any other?
By September.
Any other board questions or comments? Open up to the public. Any public comment regarding the status or the serialization, grandfathering, 50% rule? Okay. Let's go on to number 5. Discussion on the GS1 Healthcare's U.S. implementation guidelines. At the last board's e-Pedigree meeting, GS1 presented their new implementation guidelines, and this guideline has been agendized for this meeting to ensure that any interested parties are aware of its availability, and that's on attachment C. It is a 100-page document, so I don't know if you guys had a chance, because they've been awesome in coming out and giving us presentations at numerous committee meetings and even, in fact, full board meetings to help share their knowledge of the serialization process. I don't know if they wanted time again or if
Well,
they
the
show
next
open for
agenda item
questions.
kind of focuses a little bit on that.
On the new pieces?
Yes.
With that, I guess if you want to come up and focus on, I guess, more of the new pieces of your process, and that might stimulate some more questions from the industry. Is that going to be part of 6.2?
Yes.
Is that a yes?
No, I was going to ask a question. Would it be inappropriate to ask Bob what his impression was of the presentation made by the minister from Turkey?
That could be part of his public comment.
Ask Bob, see if he answers.
I'll let you determine whether or not it's inappropriate, Bob.
You can answer if you wish. You can plead the fifth if you wish.
Hi, Bob Celeste, Senior Director at GS1 Healthcare US. And so you had asked about our opinion about the Turkish implementation.
Can you bring that a little closer to you, Bob? I think
Sure.
it's, yeah.
So we've been, as GS1 Global, we have member organizations in about 110 countries around the world, and we work closely with regulators in all those countries. And we've certainly been working in the past few years closely with Turkey. And as was mentioned in the Turkish presentation, is that they do require the GS1 GTIN, a way of defining product identification. He did talk about hierarchy, and I can't answer that question right now. I need to see how they're doing that, whether they're doing it through our EPCIS standard or whether there's a different way that they're actually using that. So as far as effectiveness, certainly Turkey's been quite successful. We're glad that they're using an international standard and having come up with another unique way of doing this. And again, one of our concerns is that as regulators, and I do have a slide here to give you a sort of an idea of how many countries are developing or working on serialization and track and trace issues. And the sort of patchwork, we always talk about 50 states versus one federal, but we're also looking at across the world 150, 160, 170 countries that are also looking at this. And so our appreciation is once a country starts to use the GS1 standards, how that's more helpful to the industry. A lot of the countries, UK, for example, out and out regulates GS1 standards for use in country. Others accept them, and others have ways that we can use them in country. And so we continue to work with all the countries around the world to be able to use a standardized way of looking at products and how they move through supply chains. Not only pharmaceuticals, but we work in about 23 different industries of moving products. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but those are the areas that we're appreciative of using the standards in a way that cuts down some of the different ways that companies would need to mark their products and track them.
Well, thank you for your analysis. And I guess with that, is this going to be part of the EPCIS presentation as well? They can just move it into Agenda 5 and 6 together?
Sure.
Yeah, you have slides that we need to see, right?
Pardon me?
You have slides,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I'll present here is a look into the standards that we've been working with the industry now for almost 10, 11 years, and what we've done over those past 10 years or so with the industry, and then also talk about issues around moving forward with the standards in terms of pedigree and track and trace, or rather pedigree and serialization. So I'll go through these slides very briefly, obviously. Just want to emphasize again, GS1 is a non-for-profit standards organization. We work in 109, I know my next slide will probably say 110, different countries. We've actually, 35 years, we're actually celebrating this year our 40th anniversary of the first barcode read in the United States, and its use now around the world. We develop global standards. In other words, we work with countries and companies around the world to develop standards that can be applied globally. And then locally, in the U.S., for example, we help companies to apply those global standards to the local, in this case, the U.S. business and regulatory environment. And this slide hopefully helps a little bit in understanding the interoperability of our global standard system in that, and this does also reflect the guideline and how it's been put together by identifying 3 areas that companies need to look at in order to be able to serialize product and track it using pedigrees. So there are 3 things here, and indeed the guideline itself, my estimate was that companies that are applying the guideline to serialization and pedigree most likely will be implementing 16 of our standards. And so that pile of paper, all of our standards are very verbose. That pile of paper we've winnowed down into this small 100-page document, and the document also includes learnings from various pilots that have undergone throughout the years, best practices, and winnowing down some of the choices, some of the creativity that could be occurred in the supply chain to allow some standardization not only within the standard. So what you see here is 3 different areas of consideration. One of them is that when we look at serialization or pedigree or track and trace, we need to be able to standardize, have a standard way of identifying the things that we're interested in the supply chain. And so for pedigree, we're interested in 3 main topics. One is the product itself. And of course, in pharmaceuticals in the U.S., products are identified by the National Drug Code, NDC. Now that's a national number. In GS1 standards, we would embed that NDC or National Drug Code into our standard called a G10, Global Trade Item Number, and that's right up here. And now that becomes a global number that can be transacted around the world. So this is a way of identifying products globally around the world. Another issue with tracking items in the supply chain is, for pedigree purposes, is that these products very quickly get broken down in the supply chain, from pallets right down into eaches and back up into totes and possibly many totes, depending on how many wholesalers are in the particular supply chain. And so we need to be able to track all the packaging that an item has ever been in. So all the cases, all the pallets, all the totes, and we would identify those using one of our standards called a serial shipping container code. And that identifies the container for tracking purposes, but doesn't necessarily identify what's inside of that container. The other area that we've been working with the industry on in standardization is to identify locations in the supply chain in a standardized way. As you know, pedigree asks for a number of times of locations and trading partner locations, and so we use the GLN, Global Location Number, to identify parties inside the supply chain and locations. They could be locations such as business addresses. They could also be very granular down to which loading dock something was put on, or which area on a shelf. For example, if a hospital wanted to track it down to the shelf level. So 3 areas: locations, products, and logistics units help us with identifying the things that we need to be concerned with when we start to think about pedigree. The other area is, how do we actually mark these areas so that they can be transacted in the supply chain? And so you see here a familiar set of barcodes, both linear, two-dimensional barcodes, and then you see some RFID devices. Anything that you identify at the top level can be marked with the barcode. And in the guideline itself, we provide recommendations, and these are best practices also from the U.S. industry, around what would be marked, how they would be marked. So, for example, I think it's quite apparent that most companies are marking at the lowest saleable unit using the two-dimensional barcode. We do see some stacked barcode on certain products for purposes of the product shape itself. If you have a syringe, it's a very thin, very curved surface, and linear barcode, it can be read. Two-dimensional barcode sometimes has issues because it's like sticking your face into a doorknob. You know, some of these things get skewed, and it's hard to read. At the case and pallet level, we see more companies choosing the GS1 128 as a way of embedding the kind of data that we're interested in adding to those levels. The last level here, and this is probably the most difficult part to understand, and this is where if they say the devil's in the details, this is where he resides, is in sharing information with trading partners in a way that's secure and protected within the supply chain. Because not only in the supply chain is the product leaving the hands of a direct communication between trading partners, if you see 2-3-tier supply chains, but the information itself is also having that same situation occur, where the information is passed from one supply chain partner to another. And so we do have standards around how to identify item data, and we know in the pedigree that there's quite a few attributes that call for describing the items itself, location data, address data, all the way through order to pay transactions, but we'll concentrate mostly on pedigree and track and trace as far as the guideline itself and how to transact and share that data securely. So what I'll go through here is the purpose of why I'm speaking to you now. Some trouble with pedigrees. Talk about our standard EPCIS-based pedigree data, holding data versus having access to data, some concepts that we'd like to have a discussion around, and then some examples. So it's nice to talk about generalities and guidelines and standards and things like that, but I'd like to put this into perspective in 3 examples here. One is a counterfeit appears in the middle of a supply chain. So how does that look if we use a pedigree, more of a document pedigree situation versus an EPCIS situation? Talk a little bit about massive counterfeiting as opposed to onesie-twosie kind of counterfeiting. Also a situation where a pharmacist may be purchasing on the gray market and how that might look in either one of those areas of DPMS or EPCIS. And lastly, so from the board's perspective, what would an inspection process look like in these kind of situations? What would you encounter? And you famously, everybody quotes this, where you walk into a pharmacy, you take a bottle off the shelf, and you ask where it's been. So what takes place at that point, given these standards? So one of the purposes is, and I'll just give you a little bit of background. In 2003, the industry came to GS1 and asked whether we could help with the pedigree situation. At that point in time, it was really about what was taking place in Florida, because they had pending pedigree regulations that were due to go into effect, I believe, in 2006. At that point, we knew that we were developing the EPCIS standard and a few other standards that go along with it. But we did not know how long it would take. Sometimes standards go very quickly. Sometimes because of other issues, they tend to hold on for a few years. And so the industry, having that kind of date, 2006, we developed what's known as the drug pedigree messaging standard, specifically for Florida. In 2005, after completing that standard, we actually had a discussion with the California Board of Pharmacy, members of the California Board of Pharmacy, Florida Board of Pharmacy, Nevada Board of Pharmacy, and the FDA. And the question at that point was not whether you would accept our standard, but would you accept a pedigree that was based on the standard? So we gave an example of what a pedigree would look like, and the question was, would you accept this as being acceptable for compliance purposes? At that time, the answer was yes for the drug pedigree messaging standard. And so that was a relief. It meant that companies can make investments, they could go forward with their investments and implement. Right now, we're at the same stage with EPCIS where other than what I'll explain to you today, we'd like to have that same kind of conversation where we would bring a pedigree that was based on EPCIS standards and ask the same question. Would you find that pedigree acceptable for compliance reasoning? It really makes a big difference because companies today are making massive investments in their pedigree systems. A lot of them would like to use the EPCIS standard as that platform. I'll go over some issues with the current pedigree standard. 5 years ago, this slide was pretty much empty. This is a picture of what's going on around the world for serialization and track and trace requirements around the world. And I won't go into any one of those, but you see what's taking place, and you heard Turkey's example, is that this is no longer just a California, Nevada, Florida FDA issue. This is now global. And companies, especially global manufacturer companies that see this on the horizon, are really interested in a standardized way of serving all this. And this is why you see the two-dimensional barcode, for example. Initially, California had asked for a product ID and a serial number. But we see more and more companies coding their systems and creating barcodes with not only those two attributes, but also expiration date and lot number. And it's due mostly to what's happening and being asked for around the world. One way of doing it around the world, not a lot of alteration and changes. And so companies are trying to get in front of a lot of this and provide answers that can be applied globally. I think the addition, just as a side note, from a pharmacy point of view, the addition of lot number and expiration date in a barcode is a boon for pharmacists and for pharmacy management. If you think about the ability now, once that occurs, to manage product by expiration date, and also to have in your systems to know that whether you have that lot or not when it gets recalled is a big boon for patient safety. But this is the situation around the world, and this is growing. Again, I said we just celebrated our 40th year of the first barcode being read and all the issues around that. In order for pedigrees to work, we need to have a high level of automation. As I said in a number of my presentations, the big issue here is that bottles of drugs travel inside of logistics units, cases, pallets, totes, and so on. And in order to know where a bottle has been, we need to know where their packaging has been and be able to move back and forth between that kind of granularity. Automation is important at the large company level, obviously, for the amount of throughput that they do and the amount of automation that they already have, and also for small pharmacists to be able to not encroach on their day-to-day jobs as little as possible. And lastly, the gentleman here, I found someone that looked like an inspector, I don't know. But if, yeah, that's the inspector right there. But if you imagine wading through a large pedigree that may be, I just want to estimate, 30, 40 pages long as an inspector. So these are the kind of situations where an automated process, and I'll contribute an EPCIS option, makes a lighter tote for everyone to carry, and also a more automated way of analyzing the data inside of that piece of data. So the other thing I'd like to say is just a reminder that in regular transactions, we often refer to those transactions with identifiers. So when we talk about an invoice, we always talk about what was the invoice number. No one would ask you what was on the invoice or what line items. If you look at the row number for the product, and often you'll see a product identifier on there. And it's the same thing here that we're trying to do with EPCIS. We're trying to strip away everything that's not essentially necessary in order to tell the truth of what took place in the supply chain, and then be able to add that information later if we need to produce a report or we need to add that rich data back. This is Jenny's favorite slide. And I have to apologize for this, but it's very difficult to talk about EPCIS events and things that are happening in the supply chain without this kind of thing. But essentially, if we look at the pedigree as a document, and essentially this is what the DPMS standard, again, as like you said, it was developed for Florida, and what takes place through the supply chain. As information gets moved through the supply chain, it's added to and it grows. And it grows exponentially for a varying number of reasons. And so what we've looked at is EPCIS, which is more event-based, it's granular, and it tells us a story of why things occurred. So, and I know this is an eye chart and it's horrible, but it is what it is. So that C there is really the important piece, which is what was occurring in the business when this data was gathered. You see a C there for commissioning. There is also a packing event. So when the gentleman from Turkey was talking about hierarchies, this is how we develop hierarchies using EPCIS. We pack items into cases. We may pack cases into pallets and so on. What we didn't want to do is constrain the industry to a certain numbers of packaging, because once you do that, someone always comes up with an intermediate piece of packaging and throws everything off. So this allows free reign as far as adding as many of those packing events as you need. So if you have a bundle in the middle, or you have a bundle of bundles, or what have you, you just add another packing event on top of that. And those add up to a hierarchy building up from the each level, through the bundles, through the cases, through the pallet, and then even you could go higher for other purposes, truckloads, container loads, shiploads, things like that you may see in customs clearance and so on. The other area that's very important is this disposition, and this is something new, but it's an interesting aspect of what was the condition of the item once it went through that step. And that's really important, I believe, as far as from a patient safety standpoint. And we've seen this with some products that have gone out, come back, been pulled back, and for some reason have made it back into the supply chain. From a disposition standpoint, though, had that product been marked as being either stolen or counterfeited, or a number of other areas, quarantined here, that would have been a sure sign to someone else's systems when they received that product again that should not have been administered to a patient. And so this is one of the other areas where EPCIS provides additional information that's very important to the supply chain to understand what's taking place. It's one thing to say this is good or this is bad, but there's so much nuance in the supply chain and so many different kinds of trading partners that you really need to understand the circumstances of what's taking place to know whether the data is telling you that there's a problem or whether the data is telling you that this is a safe transaction. I'll give you an example. If a bottle was dispensed from, I know we talk about decommissioning all the time, but if a bottle had a disposition of dispense from, we would probably find it odd to see that bottle being sold again in forward logistics, in forward move in a supply chain. So we have a 100-count bottle. They dispense 30 tablets. It has now a disposition of being dispensed. And now this bottle of 100, which is now a bottle of 70, is being forward sold in the supply chain. That should raise people's ire as far as what's taking place. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, but it means it's something that you may want to think about or inspect. If that same bottle was found in a reverse logistics move, that may be perfectly fine. It may have been a recall bottle. It may have been one that I've dispensed from it, and now it's hit its expiration date, so I'm returning it back to be destroyed. That may be a very legitimate move, and one that you would almost expect to occur. So that's where dispositions allow a lot of flexibility in the supply chain, while at the same time providing data that can give you a good understanding of whether what's taking place was legitimate or not. And this is why EPCIS, although it's more difficult to understand than just adding paper to another piece of paper and just stapling things together, it's a little bit more nuanced, but at the end of the day, it allows the business to get some business benefit out of it, and it really does start to tell the truth of what actually took place so that you can interpret it from a human standpoint. So think about that as an inspector. You see a bottle, like I said, it's been dispensed from, and now someone is selling it to someone else. That's something you probably want to dig into. Again, if the bottle was dispensed from and it was being returned to a wholesaler, you'd probably say that was probably the right thing to do based on the expiration date. So there's a little bit more nuance here than we see in regular pedigree movement. Sorry about the builds here. Here's another example of pedigree. Let's see if I get one more. Sure. Pedigree versus EPCIS. In pedigree, again, because it holds so much what we call master data, or data that's being repeated over and over again. If you think about the average pallet of product that may be moving from a manufacturer to a large distributor, each box, each case may have 12 items in it. There may be 200 of these cases on a pallet. That 2,400, is that, my math is bad. But that's so many times you repeated the same exact data from one party to another. The other piece of it is that different trading partners may have different views of where something is coming from or who's sending it to them based on the information they have. So a wholesaler may have ordering information. They may have ordered from manufacturer X, and this may be the address that they know about. The manufacturer itself may be shipping from a warehouse, or it could be even a warehouse that they have under contract with someone else that controls that warehouse. So here we have two different ship froms, but they're probably telling the truth. They're probably telling the right thing. So the manufacturer is shipped from a warehouse, but the wholesaler knows in their systems about where they order things from. So this is a case where in a drug pedigree or a pedigree standard, there's a lot here to go through. And from a machine-readable standpoint or machine interpretable and actionable standpoint, it's very difficult to be able to tell whether this situation is something that should raise an eyebrow or whether this is a situation that happens every day. If we contrast that with what we're proposing is happening in an EPCIS transaction, where again we're using identifiers for places. And so we start to see identifiers in the guideline. There's a number of identifiers that can be used to identify companies and locations. One of them, for example, is our standard, the GLN, Global Location Number. We do allow DEA numbers, HIN numbers, and serialized GLNs also. But in this case, we're not matching words, we're not matching parentheses, we're not matching commas. The fact that you spell avenue A-V-E-N-U-E and I spell it A-V-E period is not a contention point. We're looking at the identifiers themselves. And we've received the other information, what we would call master information, in another way, either through another mechanism or in another transaction. And that third that third transaction is auditable. EPCIS example of the same thing. EPCIS can be used in a number of architectural settings. As you know, there's been a lot of talk about, is this a central database, essentially Turkey? Is this a semi-central database? In other words, do we put all information about one product in one database and there's another database for another product and so on? Is this distributed, as you see at top here? This is an example of distributed, where everybody has their own data and they make their own decisions about who they share data with. EPCIS is very flexible. It can be used in any of those situations. So that's a decision that has not been made yet by the industry, but the standard itself can be used in both of those situations. Should that decision be made, we'll change the guideline to reflect that architecture, but this is just a depiction that both in a decentralized and essentially a centralized or semi-centralized, the same EPCIS events are used in both cases. So in our guideline itself, and again, we released the industry, as we developed this together with the industry, felt like there was enough good information in this guideline to get out to folks who are just starting the process of identifying their products and marking them and starting to think about what does it mean to share data with my trading partners and my trading partner's trading partner and their trading partner's trading partner. The guideline actually stops at a one up and one down model. That's as far as we got by February of this year as we push this guideline out. What we're trying to avoid is duplicating a pedigree as it's defined in the law and as it's defined in our drug pedigree messaging standard in EPCIS. And you see an example here. You don't necessarily need to know what each one of these things in. Just know that to duplicate DPMS and EPCIS, you see very graphically here how much data is being created as it moves through the supply chain. It gets bigger and bigger, and that's only 3 trading partners. You can imagine what takes place when we have 5 or 6 different moves in the supply chain. And so what we did was we were challenged by the industry to say, if we took our current model, which is a one up and one down model, what could we do? What's the least impactful way that we can do to actually create the breadcrumb trail or the chain of ownership back to the manufacturer without duplicating DPMS by adding all this, pushing all the information through the supply chain. And so what we're doing, and this is part of what we are hopefully having a discussion with you about, is adding essentially a chain of ownership list, and I'll go through that later, to the one up and one down model. So one up and one down model provides a few things. It provides a very small amount of data that needs to be transacted between trading partners. Should we have, and I apologize to the wholesalers in the room, should we have a bad character in the middle, we have got 2 other trading partners that have data from them to be able to verify whether there was a problem in the middle. But also the chain of ownership list tells us a few things. It tells us where this item has been in the whole supply chain. And it also tells us, again, as I go back to our automatic challenge is, can my computer system, if I'm a dispenser, have a discussion with a manufacturer when I don't have a trading party relationship with them and I don't have some hookup with them from my system to theirs? So this audit trail or the chain of custody also includes the address of the manufacturer's EPCIS information. So my system can automatically have that conversation to ask them the question, did you put this in commerce? Is this yours? Is this legitimate? So this is what we're talking about now, a small footprint of information being passed between trading partners, and yet still that link that goes all the way back to the manufacturer, and on top of that, an automatic way of doing that, so that systems can manage a lot of this, and it's not a manual process as it moves through the supply chain. So I don't know, I'll just stop there. If there are any questions on that, then I'd like to go through some of the scenarios about what it would look like to have a counterfeit in the middle.
I have a question in regards probably about 3 slides back where you go one up, one down. You had your wholesaler, manufacturer X and wholesaler Y. It looked like it had the same ID number, but they potentially came from 2 different spots. right? One came directly from the manufacturer, one came from the wholesaler. Even on the one up, one down, wouldn't they have different identifiers?
They could have different identifiers. So you're right. This could be the manufacturer's warehouse here, and this could be the wholesaler's warehouse. But what EPCIS gives you is that ability to go back to the manufacturer to say, I'm aware of these two locations. Are they yours? Because I may have been told that, if I was a dispenser, let's say, and not the wholesaler, I may have been told by a wholesaler, I received these from this manufacturer, and now I have an ability. This is where EPCIS has a little bit of an edge on the DPMS, in that I can go back to the manufacturer and ask the question, is this, not only is the product been put into service, but is this a location that's yours?
Only reason why it would, and maybe I'm not fully understanding is there's a potential for the wholesaler, if they are a bad player, they are using the manufacturer's direct information. So if it's being shipped directly from the manufacturer and if it's being shipped directly from the wholesaler, two different physical sites, but it has the same identifier, how can you determine which one is actually coming straight from the manufacturer or through a wholesaler?
Oh, I see. So this GLN right here, that matches this one?
Yeah.
This is the wholesaler's understanding of what the manufacturer did in that shipping event. The wholesaler would then have that shipping event
Okay,
here.
so should we have a different electronic identifier?
They would have a different one for themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
They would actually, in this case, most likely, I played around with some of these identifiers. The wholesaler would probably, it's likely from this diagram that the wholesaler is using a DEA address number, and so that when they transact with their dispenser, they would use that DEA in the transferred by field.
Yeah, because I think the purpose of the pedigree is to be able to see or identify where that product, came from directly.
Right. Right. So I'll show you in a little bit. What will take place here would be in the chain of ownership list. Again, trying to cut down on the verbiage, you would see the dispenser's ID, the wholesaler's ID, which is, again, in this example, is this DEA number, and then you would see the manufacturer's ID, which is that GLN there. So that would be in the chain of ownership list locked. No one can tamper with it, but now we've got a way of going back. And also in EPCIS, we've got the address for where my computer system can go back and do that at a push of a button. Now, how long that takes, it depends on the company's, how they process their data, but it gives me a way of going back where in the DPMS model, I don't have any way of going back to check anything with anyone else. Oh. Sure.
I just want to tell the board members that Bob was kind enough to share a preview of this presentation with Ginny and myself on Friday, so we got a little bit of this stuff and had some questions that came up then. I'd just like to repeat for the benefit of the board members, which is, I had a question about whether there are GS1 subscription costs inherent in participation in this system. So in other words, I know that the manufacturers have to subscribe or be members of GS1 in order to get their GS1 product identifier. Is that what it's called?
Company prefix.
Company prefix. In order to get an assigned GLN or multiple assigned GLNs for all of their various locations, do wholesalers and retailers also need to be GS1 subscribers, or how does that process work in terms of the administrative management and costs associated with those number assignments?
And actually that did occur when we developed the guideline, and that's why you see other numbering systems be able to use here DEA and a few others. But just to answer your question, on the company prefix, which you create your product ID on, the cost to a manufacturer, there's a certain capacity that they purchase license from us, is about 10 cents per product from a GLN perspective, you can license a company prefix that gives you a capacity for many GLNs. If you just need one to identify your company, I think it's $50 to license that. And that becomes a global, it's one of those things that we manage globally to make sure that there's no one else that can have that number anywhere around the world.
Okay.
So I understand it's $50 per product? Is that
Per GLN. It averages around 10 cents a product to identify a product.
Not per each, but per product.
Right, per
Like-
product line.
product line, 9 items? Okay.
Right,
Now, is that an annual fee to maintain that? Or
The annual fee is like a tenth of that or something like that. So it's a cent, a penny.
personally, you just set it up, the product line identifier, and then just annual, a small fraction of thereafter?
Just because Bob doesn't always understand when people are speaking in layman's terms, I want to make sure that he, what we're talking about here is a GLN, which is a global locator number, which is essentially a geographic descriptor of a location in the world. I don't know if it's by longitude and latitude or whatever it is, but in some way it relates to GPS, I'm sure. And so what we're talking about is for each facility or each company, like a pharmacy would only probably need one GLN because they would only have one location to which they'd be receiving product, whereas a wholesaler might have multiple GLNs, but they would still pay only one licensing fee to have multiple GLNs. Is that correct?
Right. Actually, a GLN, just to make it more difficult, a GLN could identify an entity or a location. So in a chain of custody situation where an entity is transacting business, regardless of where that product actually physically is in the world, a company you could foresee a company only needing one GLN.
Right. They might choose to treat their entire operation as essentially a black box from which everything emanates from one location, for instance.
Exactly. So I put together a couple examples just to bring it back down to real life and not the cartoons that we've been going through, although we'll have plenty of cartoons going forward. So if we talk about a counterfeit in the middle of the supply chain, and essentially what we're talking about is a manufacturer developing, creating products, and these are just phony baloney numbers underneath here. So we've got a product, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now we start to serialize them. And so you see that in this case, the manufacturer had a very short production run of 4 items. And they created a serial number 123, 129, 733, 965, and they sold them all to a particular wholesaler who now holds those items. The wholesaler then could sell those individually to smaller wholesalers or other regional wholesalers or any other wholesaler. And in this case, we're talking about a counterfeit in the middle supply chain, so we're going to pick on wholesaler number 3 as the bad party. That's it. Yes. That might be an internet purchase, or we're assuming again a counterfeit. So, so here we have a wholesaler in the middle, and this is probably the most difficult thing to deal with. Is someone who's buying legitimate products and also counterfeit it at the same time, and then mixing those, moving down the supply chain. So here we see wholesaler number 3 has purchased one item with the serial number 129, and essentially purchased 3 other items and marked them as also 129, and then has been very careful to sell those to different dispensers. So, who has the counterfeit? That's a good question. Right. So let's take a look at this transaction. We'll forget about the legitimate ones. We'll concentrate on the difficult character. And let's look at drug pedigree measuring standard, or pedigree, as you would say. So the manufacturer has created 4 pedigrees, one for each of those products, and shipped those, hand those off to the wholesaler, who's now created their own receiving pedigree and wrapped that around each one of those. They've also created, in this case, for this one particular item, their outbound pedigree, wrapped that around the other information, and presented that to wholesaler number 3. Now, wholesaler number 3, of course, is our tricky character, and they've actually wrapped their outbound pedigree around that, and they, by the way, copied that original pedigree and created 3 more outbound pedigrees. And then passed those along to the dispensers. Right now, we can't tell, unless those dispensers have lunch together and talk about serial numbers, there's no way for pedigree to solve the situation. So I just want to underline that, just as a basis when we talk about EPCIS, that pedigree does not solve this particular issue. Unless an inspector were to go to each one of these pharmacies and somehow realize that they saw that serial number more than once, and there again, remember that inspector is going to have to walk through each one of these documents in order to figure that out.
Wasn't it the hopes that it'd be real-time going backwards and checking to see if that number appeared somewhere else? So if I was dispenser 1 and I scanned it 129, and then another pharmacy opened up and scanned 129 and said, wait, this was already sold?
In pedigree, the way it's been stated is that there's no going back to ask anybody anything. There's a document that's secure. All this information is legitimate inside of here, that this item, this character has copied. That's all legitimate, and the digital signatures work on all of those to say that's legitimate information. That's an issue. Hopefully it's not too, everybody get real quiet on that one, but that is a problem. It's very difficult to solve with pedigree, and when we talk about the dispensers doing the same thing, it'll get worse.
I think we've always understood that all we can hope to do is raise the barriers and create complications in the way of, and place complications in the way of those who would otherwise. I mean, this would require a level of technological sophistication that will be far greater than what counterfeiters currently have to do in terms of being able to receive. They first of all have to place themselves in the legitimate supply chain enough to have those trading partner relationships with all of these people in which they're exchanging this secure electronic data, and then they have to purposely manipulate that secure electronic data. So the hope is that that will be a very small cadre of people that will be confident, both competent and confident enough to do that.
Yeah, and I would say that, again, this is a situation of whenever we present things like this, somebody will always come up with the exception, and there's exception to everything. But to Josh's point, if we're talking about massive counterfeiting, this kind of game here is very difficult to do, and somebody will trip up eventually, and you'll see a crossover. You'll see a legitimate dispenser getting 2 items with the same serial number and start to question that. You'll see a lot of things occur, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. But I just want to address this only because this is one that comes up all the time about one item that somebody does. And yes, one item you can do this. Mass counterfeiting, where we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of items, it gets very difficult to manage this. The wholesaler needs to have, or that particular person in the middle there, needs to have very sophisticated systems to keep everybody else from not talking to each other. So let's look at EPCIS and see what we have here. So essentially what we're showing here is a shipping event. So this is a manufacturer shipping a case, and inside those case are 1, 2, 3, 4 items. And here's a chain of ownership list. So there's a list of each one of those items, and also in there would be the list, an address where someone can go back and ask the manufacturer questions about those items. So the manufacturer sells that one item to this wholesaler. The wholesaler now continues that list. You see the W there, which is the wholesaler. They're adding on to that list. So the wholesaler, this wholesaler number 1 is saying to the wholesaler 3 now, the manufacturer sent this to me, and now I'm sending it to you. So both of those items are in there, and both of the addresses of their electronic systems are in this chain of custody list. And now the wholesaler number 3 does what he does best, which is buy off gray market and tries to repeat that data going forward. And so you see the same situation actually occurring in this situation. As long as no one talks to each other, we can't find that one bottle. However, if we're talking about massive counterfeiting, which I think this is what we're trying to solve for, now we have a situation where, because we've not only passed what we believe took place in the supply chain, but we've allowed other people's systems to electronically and automatically check with everybody else in the supply chain, it's possible that these dispensers could come back to the manufacturer and ask a question about those. Maybe through SOP, maybe through whatever purposes, but it's possible that they may want to check with the manufacturer on something in EPCIS, which will then cause the manufacturer to start thinking about why so many checks on this one serial number. So EPCIS affords the possibility of finding this where the DPMS didn't. I'm not saying that this would occur every single day for every bottle, but it does provide the mechanism to have discussions with your trading partners and your trading partners' trading partners around what's taking place in the supply chain. And also from an inspection point of view, being able to manage this kind of small amount of data.
Bob, I don't want to be premature in asking this question, so tell me if you talk about it later, but in terms of what the actual chain of ownership message looks like or how it functions, are you planning to talk about that a little bit more in detail? Or,
yeah, I can.
Okay,
I can.
Okay,
I wanted to get the concept through first and then talk about what's inside of it. Again, we're still working on this issue, but it's a mechanism, again, to take the things that really need to be secured. So as an example, the product name probably doesn't have to be secured, as long as the NDC and the GTAN is secured. If we could identify the trading partner by an ID, that needs to be secured, not necessarily the word avenue or state or street or, whether I spelled California out or whether I just use CA as, And so in the chain of ownership list, there are a number of things. Number one, there is the identifier of the item that we're talking about, so the product ID. The next one is kind of complicated, but because we wanted something unique, then a manufacturer, we also need to protect manufacturers from inadvertently providing legitimate serial numbers to criminals. And so in that chain of ownership list is what's called a UUID. It's a way of creating a unique number that most likely no one else in the world could create that number. It's an internet thing. I could give you the calculation. But it's something that the manufacturer would pass, and only folks in the supply chain, I know even there's bad character here, would know about that number and be able to ask a question. So a manufacturer has some semblance of reasonability that who's asking the question has probably held that product. So that's called a UUID. It's a kind of a technical term, but it's a way for everybody in the supply chain to make up a number that no one else will most likely come up with. Also in that chain of ownership list is who transferred it and who received it. So we've got that link back to the manufacturer. And also, what is their EPCIS address? In other words, we're talking about computers, not humans here. My computer needs to go have a conversation with your computer about what you just sent me or what your trading partner sent me. How do I do that? How do I find your computer? So it provides that address. So the things that we believe need to be locked, which is how do I find my way back through the supply chain? How do I let the person who I found in that supply chain know that I am most likely a legitimate person in the supply chain? Those things we've locked in a small little thing that we call the chain of ownership list. I don't know if that helps.
When you're talking about address, tracking it back down to, are you talking about like to a specific computer in a facility, so like a static address or IP address, or? Most likely it would be a DNS address, and what I mean by that, and I'll pick on Pfizer just for a second. It may be www.pfizerepcis.com, and what that means is that would stay, for all intents and purposes, stay their address forever, even though, as you said, the actual address, the 192 point whatever, could change, because they may change their who's actually servicing them, who they've outsourced it to, but that other piece, the DNS piece, should stay solid through time.
So we've, as much as possible, tried to provide something that can be locked, that won't change over time, but allows companies to go about their daily business of, the person who's serving my EPCS server today is either gone out of business or I decided to move it somewhere else, and I don't want to disrupt things that are already in the supply chain. So a second example is pharmacists purchasing off the gray market. So now we've got, essentially all we've done is move the bad guy a little bit closer to the patient. And now we've got a dispenser now that's buying off gray market and also off the legitimate supply chain. And again, we have the same situation in APCIS where the manufacturer, or rather this is DPMS, manufacturers creating pedigrees for each one of the items. They move that pedigree forward. The wholesaler wraps their information around it. On the outbound, the wholesaler wraps their outbound information in the pedigree. They provide that to the wholesaler. Now this time this wholesaler number 3 is a legitimate party in supply chain. They wrap their inbound information, they wrap their outbound information, and then they provide it to the dispensers. Actually, I'm sorry, that should have gone to dispenser number 2 there. Essentially what dispenser number 2 does now, because they purchased 3 bottles off of nefarious character, they'll actually do the same thing that wholesaler did, number 3 did in the last example. They'll take the legitimate pedigree, they'll copy it 3 times, and then they'll provide their fake inbound information for 3 of those. And so now they've got 4 bottles they can sell or dispense from. Pedigree can't solve for that case. I mean, in an inspection, if you were wary enough and you could read fast enough, you'd be able to tell that bottle showed up 3 times or 4 times in that inspection. I don't have a slide here for EPCIS, but it would be obviously a smaller piece of information. So those are two extreme examples that are difficult for pedigree to handle, but it shows that EPCIS has a way of getting back through the supply chain and start to add up what's happening in the supply chain. So if we think about the inspection process, so one of the things I just wanted to push out here is that the inspector is going to have the same situation that the supply chain has in trying to interpret information from both of these areas. And I know that this is horrible, and I wish we could come up with a better way of doing this, but essentially an inspector is going to either have to read their way through this pile of data to find what's pertinent and what's changed, or they could possibly do the same thing that the supply chain is doing, is by looking at a small amount of information, the pertinent pieces, the identifiers of things and companies in the supply chain, and seeing whether they see a pattern that's taking place. If you look at a list of numbers, the difference here is that you're either reading a novel or you're looking at an Excel spreadsheet as far as whether you're looking for an anomaly. So back in our other example here, again, the inspector's going to have the same issue that the trading partners have as far as dealing with this information. One thing I will say about the Drug Pedigree Measuring Standard, or this pedigree, is that even though I'm showing this data increasing through the supply chain, each party has to actually store that data twice. The reason is because of those digital signatures. So essentially, if you think about Excel spreadsheets, they're going to have to take that data and shove it all into one cell in an Excel spreadsheet. And then as they pick it apart, they can put it in other cells, because systems, just like Excel and Word, like to help us with our data. As you know, Word likes to capitalize everything that starts after the period, and Excel likes to strip out leading zeros. Both of those things would effectively take a pedigree and have the digital signature not agree and show a problem. So if you think of this from a manufacturer standpoint of looking through this information, and determining whether there's an issue or not. A lot of paperwork, a lot of work to read through this and determine what's going on and what would happen if they encountered this kind of situation versus the numbers for the identifiers for trading partners. So the inspector will also encounter the same kind of issues if we try to duplicate DPMS in EPCIS. So the inspector is going to have to deal with all this information here and see whether this all pans out and whether that all makes sense. Versus the chain of ownership list again, which is, I think, a lot easier to look at. We're looking at a lot of data here to pan through to see what's important, why am I looking at this, what's going on in the supply chain with this particular item, versus I've got this item, I know it's been shipped from this wholesaler, and a chain of ownership list leads me back to the manufacturer. You may answer the question very quickly in an inspection. You may actually ask for more information that would need to be pulled through that supply chain. I don't know if you have any questions on that inspection process differences. So, if your brains aren't already fried on all this, EPCIS, it provides this comparable security to other business transactions. It's secure just like an invoice, just like an order would be, through mechanisms in the supply chain. It includes the capability of managing exceptions, and indeed we've been working on exceptions for quite a while, and the next version of this document will outline how those are managed. Right now in DPNS we don't have a way of dealing with exceptions. EPCIS, it's been tested in pilots, a number of pilots. You've seen the Abbott McKesson VA one, I think 2 meetings ago or so. It's more effective in that there's less master data errors that can be pushed through the supply chain. Again, master data changes even in companies. It comes from many different sources, and if we push all those different sources through the supply chain, we end up with some variance in the supply chain. It's a little bit more auditable data. It's better suited for supply chain use. It's more flexible in the value of information, allows trading partners to expose data only about the actual products traded. So we can be very careful about what information we're providing to trading partners and not expose legitimate serial numbers to nefarious characters. It can be supported in many different architectures that still have yet been determined, distributed, central, semi-central. It allows trading partners to choose the amount of data provided to them. So a trading partner, and especially if we think about an independent pharmacy, they may not want all that data. They may want something that a small application could analyze for them and tell them whether they've received a legitimate chain of custody. They may not want to go through all that data. And also, lastly, we'll publish a set of standard messages, which we have done so far, but also the queries. What are the things you could ask a trading partner? How exactly would you do that? That would be in a future version of the guideline. So how do I find out whether this is true or not? Those queries will specify very, very directly. So I have other slides in here. I'll leave them for you as far as different ways to look at things, but I think that's enough punishment for today.
I have a question. Now, in regards to an inspector comes in, pulls out a bottle of drug A. He wants to see the purchasing history for drug A. Whether it's electronic or on paper, would it list the identifying, the serial number IDs of all the purchases listed out? So if there's any duplicative numbers, it could be identified by the inspector. So in case of the example, would the 129 show up multiple times, therefore flagging a investigation?
If an inspector were to go into a pharmacy, let's say, and say, just like you said, take a bottle off the shelf and tell me where this has been, they should be able to verbalize, based on that chain of ownership list, where they believe it's been. And then if the inspector said, produce the full report, then there may be a period of time before that company would be able to pull all the other information to prove what they just said, pull that forward through the supply chain. They may also already have some of that data, so they may have, obviously, hopefully they would have what all the NDC codes are, what product we're talking about. But they may have to pull forward some of the address information. But initially, in a verbal format, you should be able to say where they believe the item is.
Because it would, that would identify where the fraud took place. If it was through a gray market wholesaler, his dispensing would outnumber what he purchased, because I doubt if he's going to show invoices from that gray market wholesaler. So that's where you're going to find out that he's dispensed more than he purchased through a traditional wholesaler. If his purchases match his dispensing, then that would lead me to suspect that the wholesaler was the culprit, because he did buy it from a legitimate wholesaler. So those kind of things would key in where the investigator would concentrate their.
Right, Randy. I didn't mean to imply earlier that this kind of fraud or counterfeiting could not be detected, but I think it would require utilizing several different investigative techniques by an inspector. So I think what Bob is saying is that just looking at an individual bottle and seeing everywhere that bottle has been wouldn't necessarily tell you that in the stock of that pharmacy or in the stock of multiple pharmacies are 3 other bottles also bearing the same SNI. But I think if, let's say, the fraud is taking place at the pharmacy level, where the pharmacy has just added 3 new bottles, added the same SNI to 3 new bottles, what the inspector could do is, take a complete inventory of all SNIs and see if there's any duplication, and/or see, like you say, look at the dispensing history and see if it outnumbers the acquisition history in the typical way that inspections are done. Likewise, at the wholesaler, if you do a history, if we look at the history of all outbound SNIs, if there's any duplication there, that would be a red flag that would warrant further investigation. So it wouldn't, I think what Bob is saying is it wouldn't automatically be detected. And one of the greatest joys that we're hoping for from the pedigree system is that a lot of this will be automatic and not be forensically investigated later, but that trading partners would have a greater ability to automatically detect fraudulent or duplicative SNIs.
What about the decommission of the serialization?
Well, that's kind of an interesting topic, decommissioning, and that's
wouldn't that negate, or wouldn't that be a flag that there's 2 other or 3 other?
Yeah, I think that lends to our thought that if there was, and everything is possible if you want to spend for it, but if there was a cloud in which you send information and it says, yes, this was sold, so, and you send somebody else says, at point of receiving that, wait, somebody else already received it, that was kind of the hopes, but probably just technologically just wait,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that a completely centralized cloud-based system would provide the kind of automatic interdiction of those kinds of fraudulent stuff that this decentralized system will not necessarily.
Yeah, and to your point about decommissioning, and that's where I bring that what generally term end-of-life things. So decommissioning has the effect of saying that this thing doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And if someone was to do that, let's say they did it and that now it can come back into the supply chain or something occurs, the dispositions that we have listed here provide you a little bit better information of what's actually taking place. So a decommissioned item, as we try to work through this, would be very difficult to move back to a destruction facility too, because it doesn't exist, and yet we're trying to move this thing. So that's why I couch a couple of things like stolen, damaged, dispensed as tends to be end-of-life situations. So it's a little bit more granular, but it provides you a better idea of what's really happening, and it doesn't allow for. If you think about a reverse logistics move and someone who's legitimately trying to get rid of something that's decommissioned, and yet they get inspected and they have this thing that supposedly doesn't exist, and there it is physically, it's there.
Right, and this is still to be worked out in the technology, but my personal sort of policy belief about it is that what is preferable is to have certain ought not to be dispensed again kind of codes, or ought not to be transacted again kinds of codes, like as you're pointing to, not that the number itself would be eliminated, but that the number would refer to events that should raise suspicion about any certain types of subsequent events. So in other words, a resale event should not follow a sent for destruction event or likewise.
Right. It allows also for example, things that are very close to expiration date that may be donated to other causes or things like that. It allows them to have a disposition that targets them for that cause and not to be found back into the supply chain.
Is there a certain outcome you were hoping for from this presentation to the committee?
I think today we just wanted to kind of start the conversation around what it is, because it is different. And then come back again, and again, just like with the DPMS, say, here's something that was created using this.
Right.
There's some pilots that we'd like to have take place around the chain of ownership list, so we could provide some really good data back, and then be able to say, should someone present you with a pedigree based on this architecture, would it be acceptable? That essentially needs to be answered. Otherwise, folks will just not invest and move forward on it.
And this, maybe I'll take the board members' direction on this. It may be premature to do this, but one of the things that Jenny and I talked with Bob and the other members on the call on Friday about was the ways in which our law, written originally in 2003, was written in essentially a pre-EPCIS environment, or EPCIS existed, but it wasn't utilized for this purpose. And so it is written in a way that more grammatically or programmatically meshes with a DPMS type of world, where you're actually sending and receiving essentially complete electronic documents. And so EPCIS is different than that. Unless you use the chain of ownership pointers, as I call them, to pull forward the entire chain of ownership data, you would not, in every single transaction, be receiving a complete chain of ownership document. You would be receiving only the document from your immediate trading partner showing their transaction with you. And then if you wanted anything more, you'd have to go out to these EPCIS and identifiers that are housed at individual sites, or maybe housed centrally or wherever they are, to pull in that information. So that's, the board is going to have to consider and decide whether that constitutes receipt of a pedigree or transmission of a provision of a pedigree within the meaning of the law, and or there's the specific certification piece. Well, yeah. Are you able to see the certifications provided by trading partners that are not your immediate trading partners as part of what you're able to see in order to have confidence in the data that you're receiving? So those are the two main I don't want to say obstacles because that sounds too negative, but those are the two main questions that will need to be asked about what is provided under EPCIS and whether it complies with the law.
Well, there are two points. I think it makes sense that you know exactly who you bought it from, and they know exactly who they sold it to, but you may not be necessarily be able to validate it. They got it from C, D, down the line. And it makes sense when it's 10 years old, the first draft. We don't want to already try to propose something that's over a decade old. So I would think it would be the committee's recommendation for the board staff to use current language as a descriptor, and then we can vet it out and then make a recommendation to the full board.
Okay.
on its acceptance.
I got you.
And just one last thing. So we've done this with a number of industries using EPCIS, and typically what happens on day one, everybody doesn't trust anything, so they pull everything forward. So we did this in the apparel industry, and everybody pulled everything forward until their systems were filled with data. And then they started to trust that it was there, and they said, okay, we'll pull every 100 one. And then finally they got to a point where stability enough where they had good guidance through their SOPs of when you pull something forward, if you had a question, or when you believe that the information was still there, and you could do that. But
well, that's exactly why we have this thing going for so long. Is we want the public safety for California is paramount. but we just want to make sure we do the right thing and not just put up, technological barriers for the industry to get the meds out, which is counterproductive to the public safety of California. So it's a long, drawn-out process, and I, applaud the patience of the industry and their willingness to share. Sometimes it's sensitive information, but it's necessary information. So we will applaud the industry for taking part. Public safety, that's our charter. I guess, unless there's any other questions from the board? Any questions from the industry or public? You want to take a quick break then, or?
That works for me.
Oh, what's the next one going to be? Ooh, inference might be, no. Your call.
There's at least one other.
Oh, we'll just take a quick break. How about 10 minutes, then we'll think about, we'll get it to lunch in too. So quick 10-minute break, 15-minute. Lunch?
Well,
So is it going to be?
you guys want lunch now, or?
Democracy, let's vote. Lunch? Oh, yeah, lunch has it. How about, let's see, 1 o'clock?
Yeah.
1 o'clock. Okay, thank you for coming back, and we're going to reconvene our e-Pedigree committee meeting. I hope you all had a good lunch, ready to interact. We're going to go. It could be agenda item 7, and this is going to be allow opportunity for any interested parties to share with us information on where they're at when. With our implementation schedule. Was there a for sure presenter on this?
For sure, we have one. Bill Fletcher is going to do a presentation, so we can start with him.
Certainly. Yes, sir.
All right. So I won't spend too much time introducing myself, but my name is Bill Fletcher. I'm managing partner of PharmaLogic Solutions. And what I do is I help life sciences companies implement solutions for serialization, traceability, largely around the California law. I've helped 18 so far, large companies, rolling on to number 19. And in that journey, I've learned a lot of really good lessons. I don't sell software, I don't sell hardware. I just help them put in place the requirements. I would applaud GS1 when Bob presented the EPCIS notations up there, that's really been helping drive some of the use cases and cut out a lot of the complexity associated with getting those requirements out. So GS1's really doing a nice job of helping the industry define their requirements. So what today's presentation is about is a couple-fold. One, I put together some scenarios that clients of mine and others at industry events have asked me about, largely around the 50% rule. There's still some confusion out there about what constitutes the 50%, and so I just put some scenarios together. My hope was that I would present those today. I think one of the really valuable artifacts from years ago was the Q&A document produced. That was really well done. That helped answer a lot of questions. My hope would be that some of what I present today can be used as the foundation for helping answer some of these questions now, so that as these companies move forward and begin to implement, that they're doing so with the right understanding of what the 50% rule means. I have a couple things on inference in there, and then again, my objective was to leave behind this presentation and let you all look at and give some consideration to this in the future. So one of the scenarios that comes up all the time when people are talking about the 50% rule is that they're going to base this on what they think they're going to sell. And, you know, things don't always turn out that way. And so what's going to happen is if they come to you and they say, you know, it's December 2014, here's what our 50% is, and this is what we think it will be. And then we find out that for some reason there's some action that causes them not to be able to sell anywhere near what they expected to sell. And there's a sudden downturn. So as they go through 2015, that's not going to be the 50% of the products. So if people want to know what will the ramifications be. All right, and so for purposes of the presentation, I'll ask questions, but they're more or less rhetorical right now. My hope is that we can get some feedback.
Okay. I have two attorneys, but neither of them are in the room. I can answer some of these.
That'd be great.
Or the committee can, or do you want to do it kind of like Q&A? We have lots of Qs already, and I'd like to thank the number of you that have sent in your Qs to the board. We haven't done the A part of it, so we'll get to the A's. We're in the process, as I keep saying, I sound like a broken record, redesigning our website, but we haven't yet quite pulled that one off. One of the things we intend to do is to put a Q&A document up on the website that corresponds to the current law. The Q&As that are up there now were done prior to 2008, so there may be some lag. In this particular case, our intent is to, if we got into the weeds low enough where someone said that they were going to sell 50% of their line would be 10,000 units. And when the real world came around during the course of the year, it wasn't 10,000 units, it was 8,000 units that was going to be their 50%. Do they have to do the other 2%? Is that the kind of the question? Or the 2,000, it would be 2,000?
20%, yeah.
See, I stalled long enough. Look what happened.
Yeah.
No, Josh, it's okay. We're just doing question and answers. The intent is good faith, and if they could comply with the requirement, we would expect them to go ahead and do it. In this case, they might be in a production mode to fill the 50% a little higher than the 50%. We think the downstream partners would benefit by having the maximum quantity of serialized product in the supply chain, so we would encourage them to go ahead and produce it. But do they have to scale back? Could they scale back? Yes. I think the other half of the question is, what happens where you think you're going to sell 10,000 units and instead strong demand for your product makes it 20,000 units, and suddenly now your forecast is off? I think there you need to talk to us a little bit about, you know, if it turns out that what was a 10,000 unit quantity being 50% has now become 20% or 20,000 units, then you can talk to us a little bit. Because if your projections are solid and you just had a sudden spike, I think we'll work with you a little bit on that. We're looking for overall compliance long term. We're not looking with a calculator to catch you on January 1, 2015, or January 1, more specifically, January 1, 2016.
Yeah, and I believe the legal counsel would also state that as far as the definition of what is 50%, we left it pretty open to the manufacturer to define it. I mean, the board was very, very flexible, having the industry define what their gauge is for 50%. And I believe it's going to be based upon production, not necessarily sales. However, if sales determines whether you stop producing it or not. But it basically believe, unless our legal counsel says otherwise, it's based upon 50% of production, and you are defining the 50%. So it gave a lot of flexibility to the industry.
Actually, that 50%, the flexibility is what's created a lot of the questions at all.
But prior to January 1, 2015, that December 31st, 2014 date, someone with the authority to bind the company is committing under penalty of perjury, this is how we're going to hit the 50%, this is how we believe we're going to hit it, and then if we think that the estimate was totally bogus, we have the ability to reject it.
All right. So, okay. Good. All right. That actually teed up the next couple. So
come on up here, Josh.
Yeah, I was hoping Josh was going to. So pedigree goes nowhere. The manufacturer produces serialized goods and ships to a wholesaler. The wholesaler is not yet required to accept the pedigree. What does the manufacturer do with that pedigree before the wholesaler begins to accept it? You know, so they're in good faith. It's 2015 now. They're half goods into a black hole. Where does that pedigree go? Because the wholesaler isn't required yet to receive it.
It may come into effect in July 2017 if the product is still in the supply chain. It may not have been appended by the wholesaler because they didn't have to append it until July 2016, but it puts into production a whole series of product that's available to the downstream partners to run tests on in terms of how they're going to handle moving an appending pedigree. And so there's your benefit.
So the if I understand that, the wholesaler needs to begin to receive and hold these pedigrees so that after their July 2017 date, that they have pedigrees for products that they would then begin to ship further.
I'm not sure I said it like that. I think the wholesaler does not have to do anything until July 2016.
Right. So again, back to the original question, the manufacturer is producing these and they're sending them, but there's nobody there to receive them.
Bill, if I could get your attention over here for a second.
Welcome to the front of the room.
Yeah, I apologize for sitting underneath your slides, but there's only so many spaces over there. So the legal answer to your question is that the wholesaler is not required, neither the manufacturer is not required to transmit pedigrees, nor is the wholesaler required to receive pedigrees prior to the actual date of July 1st, 2016, that requirement comes into effect. So, but we fully anticipate that will be the plowing the field, plowing the furrows time period during which there will be some practice of sending and receiving pedigreed, that the serialized products will actually be related to serialized pedigrees. In terms of the sort of sidebar that you and Ginny started to get into, I want to be careful to say that we are not saying that gratuitously transmitted and received pedigrees somehow establish some new requirement. Those would still be product that was in your possession prior to the implementation date. So under our regulation, the wholesaler would still be entitled to identify that product in their declarations saying, this is product we received prior to our implementation date that is not subject to pedigree requirements, regardless of whether it did or did not have pedigrees attached to it. So I don't want to imply that people should be cautious about voluntarily participating in serialization and pedigree pilots for fear of somehow creating a requirement that doesn't exist. The only requirement is that going forward from that date from that date forward, they can no longer receive a product that doesn't have a pedigree attached to it.
But beginning on January 1st, 2015, that manufacturer, they're producing their serialized goods that they said they would, and they're shipping those serialized goods. They're ready to produce a pedigree, but no one that they ship to is saying, I'm ready to receive it. That's a perfectly fine situation.
Well, I wouldn't say it's fine. It's less than ideal, but yes, legally it does not violate any legal requirements.
Got it.
But the whole reason, the whole sort of intent behind the staggered implementation, and the whole reason that the legislature, gave that timeline to the industry when it was requested, was that it was anticipated that this 2-year, year and a half period would be used to prevent further delays once the full implementation date comes into effect.
Got it. Thank you. I think that will help because this comes up all the time.
As we've told several people in meetings, just sort of individual meetings, the board has taken the approach, and board members can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is what the board has said is that 2015 to July 1st, 2016 is sort of the good faith period during which manufacturers can establish their good faith by way of complying with the 50% declaration requirement and sort of starting to send product through the system, such that if they reach that, subsequent to July 1st, 2016 period and are having problems with their serialization, or that their product would otherwise be unavailable to the market because of some problem that has developed, the board is more likely to be understanding and not take that as an enforcement, but more of a working together time period even after July 1st, 2016, if the manufacturer and the wholesaler have to that point demonstrated their good faith.
Perfect. Okay. Next scenario is around inventory. So the manufacturer produces products in early 2014 that may not ship from their warehouse until into 2015. Yes, I'm sorry. Oh, that's him. Okay. That's okay. That's okay. When you were speaking over my head, that happens all the time, so I'm used to it. So then, if those items are among their 50% that they designated, can they still be shipped into California because they were packaged and in inventory at the manufacturer before 2015, even if not serialized? So this is, one of the issues in the industry right now is that companies go in and they begin producing products, and in second quarter 2014, they're producing products that may not actually leave their facility until 2015. So what it does, it accelerates when they actually have to have the serialized packaging lines ready and the associated systems to record it. So it's really kind of moved up the clock for a lot of these manufacturers just because of the way they do business. And they're concerned and under the belief that if they're producing these products, the grandfathering thing gets kind of misunderstood here. And there's a belief these fall into the grandfathering. We produced them before the 2015 due date, but they're part of the group of products that they've said will be in that 50%. So could they go ahead and ship that? It would be excluded from the 50%, right? They wouldn't be penalized even though they said.
Well, there is not a clear legal answer to this question. This is going to be a sort of board enforcement question, but here's what I'll say. I don't think that anyone anticipated that manufacturers were going to have a clean and clear demarcation between manufacturing runs done, up to and including December 31st, 2014, and those that start on or after January 1st, 2015. I mean, this is the real world we're talking about. Everyone understands that manufacturing takes place over periods of time in runs and lots. So I think people are worrying about this over much. I understand everyone's need to comply and 10K statements and all that kind of stuff, but I just want to make sure that what I would say about that is, again, this is the good faith period. The main goal of this provision is to make sure that manufacturers have a plan in place such that by beginning of 2016, they will be fully serialized for their distribution into California. So I think they should be as forthcoming as they feel comfortable being about where they are in their production process. And, this would have been 50%, except that we started this run, 2 months prior. I don't think anyone's going to take that too seriously. You don't need to worry too much about exactly hitting 50% at some magical moment in time that's January 1st, 2015. As long as you can show that, if you exclude these 2 months that happened in second quarter 2014, going forward from January 1st, 2015, on the same manufacturing timeline, we would have otherwise hit 50%. You know what I mean? Sort of show that 50% is what you're striving for, and that you will hit it by the end of 2015. Then I think that's the appropriate way to handle it.
Yeah, I think in life sciences, it tends to be very literal.
Right.
Okay, everything's validated. We have certain processes. These are big. These are this is not a trivial situation here. So people are seeing it as black and white.
Right.
And then in the course of trying to plan for the 50%, this whole issue of what are we going to do with our inventory comes up.
I think far be it from me to tell multinational corporations how to run their business, but if it were me, I think I would target 60% or something that gives you lots of clearance for any of these smaller interpretation questions to not be as much of an issue. Now obviously that requires a lot more investment than hitting 50%, but I think that's the strategy.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is because the board or the committee recommendations were pretty broad, non-prescriptive on purpose, and so industry to be able to argue a case. And if you have a production plan that this drug is due to being released at this time, this production drug is supposed to be released at this time, kind of like a projection of where you're at and where it's going to equate in your percentages. They just want to see forward progress. They don't want to come seeing in July of 2016 that 2% of your product is serialized. That's not showing good faith, and so it is intended to be broad, and that creates anxiety in itself. But it's also meant so that you can justify the case, and like Josh said, it's going to be like the seatbelt law. It'll be in place for a while before you start getting hit.
All right. Let's see. Next one. So unit volume. There's a specialty manufacturer, high price, low volume products. They select to designate 50% based on the unit volume. So what they're going to do is they're going to begin, if they look at 2015, they're going to make sure that 50% of their overall volume is serialized. But for the first 6 months, they may not be shipping serialized product. But the entire end of 2015 would be all serialized product. So if you look at 2015 in its entirety, they will have shipped equal 50% or more of their overall volume will have been serialized. Where would that, this is, you're not going to see this with the really huge, but there's a lot of life sciences companies where the volume is not so great that they can't say, we're not going to be ready to serialize until mid-year 15, but we can make sure that by mid-year 15, everything's being serialized.
So they would be filing that in their December 2014 plan with the board. And their 50% is the first 6 months they do nothing, the second 6 months everything.
What if they said,
well, that's your 50% for the year. You're doing 0 in the first 6 months. You're doing the 100% in the second 6 months,
well,
right?
My understanding was but my understanding was they don't need to tell you the first 6 months or the second 6 months. They just need to say, for our product, all our products in 2015, 50% of them will be serialized, period. And so it might be the first 3 months that they're not serialized, whatever. But the point being that if they're not quite ready on 2015, but they have the capability sometime later in the year and they can ensure that their volume will meet the 50%, they report it and say, we will be shipping by volume in 15.
Again, they're stating that this is how they're going to comply. They've got an official that's binding the company saying that we'll be ready to do it. This is how we're going to do it. I don't know, Josh, you're going to add something too?
No, I was just actually going to say that I don't think we ought to answer this question at this point.
By SKUs, so you have a company with 100 SKUs, they'll designate 50 SKUs for serialization. However, the 50 SKUs make up, for example, only 1% of their sales, or alternatively, the 50 SKUs make up only 1% of their volume. So they're picking 50% of their SKU.
Yeah, that's what the law allows. So
You guys make the definition.
yeah, the law specifically allows for various ways of designating the 50%, and SKU and package type is one of them. So that would seem to be fine.
But it's based on the sales in California that you're basing the 50%.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, that should be implied for all of this, is that this is just sales to California. Yeah. Likewise, product family, company has 10 brands, they designate 5 brands, same thing.
Right. I think this statute was designed not only to give maximum flexibility, but also with some understanding that, for say a 2-line manufacturer that only has 2 product lines, that even though one of those product lines might represent, 75% of their volume, the investment that's required to bring either of those lines into serialization compliance may be equivalent. And so designating by line or by product family is also an appropriate way to designate.
All right. And that's true even if it's the 1% of sales or 1% of volume. Has nothing to do with it. Okay. All right. So manufacturer identifies 50% of its annual projected volume into California. They commit to serializing all the defined SKUs. They report the SKUs to California, but again, this is kind of back to the earlier one where the sales suddenly drop off. And so in this situation, come back to you guys and say, we had a plan, we submitted it to you, but for these unforeseen reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna come back to them one way or the other. I mean, they're going to have 100% by 2016. So it doesn't really, whether it's done in July 2015 or January 1st, 2016, it's most important that they have full serialization by January 1st, 2016.
Have a chance to report that to us in another year.
Right. All right, and so this is they went ahead and did it. If they had inventory of unserialized goods, this is back to the similar to the earlier one.
Right.
All right. Some manufacturers are concerned that when they send the DPMS pedigree, if you pedigree, say, an entire pallet of goods is all on one electronic pedigree document, and you send that pedigree, the original electronic file that contains that original shipment of a pallet or even more than a pallet is appended, and as anything that was on that pallet is shipped forward, that original pedigree that had the digital signature is sent, and it's wrapped with just what moved further. And so there's trade information going forward that some companies don't want all that trade information going all the way down the supply chain. So they've adopted a policy of creating an electronic pedigree per case. So in this example, they ship 50 cases. They would create 50 separate pedigrees. Each pedigree would be then sent to the wholesaler. The wholesaler, as they distribute a case, only the original pedigree for that case would move to the next recipient.
If I can just anticipate, Bill, there's no requirement in the law that pedigree reflect any aggregate container. So you could have, whatever it is, 144 separate pedigrees for all, because the pedigree requirement only requires that you track at the unit. Tracking above the unit is a convenience factor that is, or a necessity factor that has been, part of the logistics of how you do that, but it's not the legal requirement. So you could have as many individual pedigrees for individual units or aggregations of those units as you choose. There's no per shipment requirement of pedigree, or that you only have one pedigree with one shipment or anything like that.
That's a business decision.
Good. I think a lot of people will be glad to have heard that rather than just assume it. I think that was the purpose for this one. That's actually becoming quite a common way of doing it. The quantity for inference, of course, I know you guys are looking at that. That's been quite a buzz. The 48, is 48 the right number? I literally, I think, have heard from several dozen companies that's too small a quantity. And I know you're looking into it. I wanted to pose the question today, to ask for some type of a higher number and see where the board's thinking on that is, as well as when a pallet is shipped. We haven't really discussed inference with respect to pallets moving forward. What I read implies that the pallet contents can't be inferred, which is a common practice in other industries. And where's the board sit on if I, as a manufacturer, ship a pallet and that pallet goes through, and it's not real common, but it does happen, and then that pallet is shipped further, do they have to break down that full pallet and scan everything?
It's in our definition, right?
Well, I assume the board will address that as part of the regulatory process. Several of the as written, the regulation only applies the inference to sealed homogeneous cases. There is no inference applicable to pallets as written. But several of the comments that we received were advocating for or requesting an inference for pallets, at least in some limited circumstances. So that's a decision the board will have to make, or this committee will recommend to the board, or the board will make, as to how broadly to apply or allow for the application of inference. So I don't think it's something we can answer right now.
All right. One other question that came to me is, this has come up a few times too, it's just inference in general. Since all items will be scanned in their sellable unit form before dispensing, why not allow any size of container? If the items are not what are recorded on the pedigree, they have to be returned. How would a patient be harmed if the item I have doesn't line up with a pedigree because I couldn't dispense it, I don't own it, I don't have a pedigree for it? And how would the Board of Pharmacy's investigation be hindered if an item in a sealed case do not match the pedigree, because those would never end up reaching the patient? Since there's not a valid pedigree, the person dispensing it couldn't legally dispense it and they'd have to return it.
One of the things,
that's not really a question the board can answer. That's basically, that would be a different law than the law that was given to the board, because the law as written specifies that except where inference is to be permitted, it will always be tracked at the individual saleable unit, and that will be reflected on the pedigree at each stop. So it would be sort of saying that the legislature ought to have written the law such that the only time you will scan the individual unit will be at the point of dispense, which would be an authentication model as opposed to a track and trace or pedigree model. So that's just a different model. I'm not expressing a policy opinion on which is better or worse, but that would be just a different law than what was given to the board. So
I just add that authentication would be a nice to have in addition to what we've got, but as Josh says, it's the unit that's tracked through the system.
And I'll just say, I'm not the legislators who wrote this law, but it appears to express an intent to create a closed system where the participants in the supply chain have as much or more ability to stop and interdict and prevent further transmission of counterfeits or adulterated product and it's not just a forensic purpose that's served by this. So that forensic purpose would, I mean, that interception purpose would not be served within the supply chain if the members of the supply chain were not also scanning individual units, or at least inferring individual units.
This particular one comes up a lot in conversation. The last one I just talked about, so the point may not be clear to those in the industry. So if you are working on some type of updated Q&A thing, we want to make sure that people understand that why the law is written the way the law is written. Because people ask, why do we get so carried away with this when it's always going to get scanned before it gets dispensed, and so it's eventually going to get caught.
I think it's also just important to remember the origin of California's law, which is this is the model that was proposed originally by the FDA as part of its counterfeit drug task force in 2003 and 2004. So California essentially took the word of FDA as to what was the best model to prevent counterfeit and adulterated product from getting into the supply chain. So I don't know that it was an independent judgment made, at least not by this board. It was made by the legislature and by the FDA.
Yeah, no one was talking authentication, I don't think, until about 2007, I don't think. I don't remember hearing it much before then.
Well, that's everything I have to present. I appreciate the opportunity to pose some of the questions that come up in the industry. Thank you very much.
Okay, is there any board questions or committee questions? Are there any comments from the public regarding the presentation? Okay.
Open mic.
Is there any other companies that would like to give a status update on their readiness to meet the California's staggered pedigree implementation?
Well, Ginny waved me up, so it's your fault, Ginny.
Sport.
My name is George Pennebaker. I've asked to talk for a couple minutes because I feel there's some comments that need to be made to get things back on track. I'm a pharmacist, and my comments are short, but I feel a need to introduce myself because many of the people in the audience don't know where I'm coming from. I've been a pharmacist for a long time now, and I've been involved with computers in pharmacy for over 40 years. I'm also a columnist for a magazine called Computer Talk for the Pharmacist. I've been writing columns for that magazine since 1985. Been involved with the Medi-Cal management, millions of transactions going through pharmacies and the Medi-Cal system, being paid every day. 15-year member of NCPDP, and for the last 5 years or so, I've been filling prescriptions on a part-time basis, so I'm familiar with what's going on in the pharmacy counter as well. And I've been a board watcher since 1958 or 59 or so I've been to a lot of board pharmacy meetings for one reason or another. I think we need to go back to the objective of all of this. And that original objective was to stop counterfeits. The track and trace method does not stop counterfeits. We've seen that on the slides today. And nobody's maintaining that they do. The track and trace mechanism is interesting and fun, lots of data to fly around for everybody to file away in their electronic filing cabinets. Not solve the problem. There is a simple solution. It's been alluded to a few times today, and that's you put a unique identifier on each container, and if that ID shows up too many times, you investigate. The mechanisms are there through the NCPDP standards and can be put in place to establish that that database to be accessed every time a pharmacist clicks on the container with that many-digit number that identifies it uniquely and does hopefully have the expiration date and lot number on it. And if you get that hit twice in 2 different pharmacies, then you got a problem. And if a pharmacy buys a bottle of 500 tablets and they dispense 600 or 700 out of it, that's okay. When it gets up to 800 or 900, then you raise the flag and start to check things out. The objective is counterfeiting. Let's get after it. Let's get back to that objective. And if it takes re-education of the legislature, re-education of the FDA, or whoever needs re-education, they need to be reminded of the objective and the relatively simple solution that can be put forth to accomplish that objective. And of course, this is not a state issue. It's a national issue. In fact, it's an international issue, as brought out earlier today. And so whatever we do, whatever is put forth, needs to be compatible with larger systems as well. So I think that it's relatively simple and straightforward, and I would suggest that efforts be made to get back to those basic things that we were trying to do when this whole thing started in 2005. We've lost track of the objective.
Thank you. Many times we need to be refocused on what the original vision was. Any comments from the board? Any other open mic? You don't have to sing a song or anything. Okay, with that, then I guess we'll go to agenda number 8. Discussion to develop regulations requirements to permit inference as provided by the California Business Code, Business Profession Codes 4163. We will try to hear comments and work on proposed regulation language for inference. We've been working on this, well, actually several renditions or requests for information for many years have occurred. And I think July 2012, that was the first time we started requesting specific comments. They weren't as many as we hoped for, but those comments are on our website under, well, I think it's on our agenda, that long web identifier. At the March enforcement e-Pedigree meeting, we released some language, draft language, and to help stimulate some questions, some comments, and it has served its purpose. We have gotten a number of comments coming back, and those are going to be on attachment D. So at this committee, we'll try to work on some proposal for the inference. Bring up attachment D. Here on there, I think it was refers to on the well, A. It's talked about that all the participants would be the distribution chain, manufacturers, wholesalers, or pharmacies who furnish and administer or dispense of dangerous drugs.
This is the same.
If you want a paper copy, it's in front of you.
But basically, A, is there any comment on that section? Josh, you want to, on the inference, A?
I'm sorry, are we going section by section? Is that how you wanted to go here? I don't know how I have those stuff, but thank you. I don't know how the board members would like to proceed on this. I don't know what would you like to be your takeaway from today? Are you hoping to do sort of
I don't know if we can really, we don't have a quorum, so we can't really make a recommendation to the board, but if there's maybe some bullet points we want to work on.
I mean, I can sort of, you've all read the same comments that I read, but I could tell you what I think are some of the primary issues that have been raised by those comments.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's the
some,
most useful
like
way to go.
Said,
or
exactly like the case or palette.
Right, I mean, that's clearly one of the most primary ones that was raised by several of the comments is that, and even, you have to break down inference into its component parts, that there's system-wide inferences that could be permitted. For instance, the board's regulation proposes to essentially create a system-wide inference for sealed homogeneous cases, that those could go from manufacturer to wholesaler or multiple wholesalers through to the final final recipient, the dispenser, without being opened until they are received at that final dispenser. So that's a system-wide inference, or it's actually made up of several inferences, of a ship inference and a receive inference at each of those locations. Then you could choose to do the same thing with regard to pallets. You could say that if a pallet goes all the way through the supply chain without being unsealed until it's broken down for purposes of dispensing, that could be another system-wide inference. Or what we've heard more specifically from the distributors is that they would like to have an inference that applies just to their receipt of a sealed pallet or a shrink-wrapped pallet until such time. It's essentially a temporal inference, that they're going to scan those individual units before they leave their facility, but they're not going to scan them for purposes of put away. So that they would like to be able to put away an entire undifferentiated pallet based on the pallet case item. So there's those kinds of decisions that this body or the board will ultimately need to make. I don't know if it's most useful to go through those here or not.
Because I think some of them are intermingled too when you're talking about, secure taping, and then whether it's pallet or case or, a shipping cargo bin. And then they're talking, some say that they don't really want a trusted partnership, but then how can you have an SOP to ensure inference if you don't have any working relationship with whoever the seller is? So I think that's part of how you can infer, is if you know what an SOP is from that individual group. They're talking about not necessarily wanting a sealed or manufacturer seal on it. And then again, how can you feel comfortable with inferring if you don't have any kind of agreement with whoever your upline person is? That's how it maintained its integrity.
Right. I think what you're pointing out is that there is not a uniformity of perspective reflected in the comments. There are some commenters who seem fine with the trusted trading partner concept, but want to pare back its requirements. There are some that don't like the concept. There are some that want to define the case in some more flexible way. There's some that don't want the case to be significant at all in terms of the sealed tape or the tamper-proof tape. So I think you're right that there are lots of different possible comments. I apologize that I'm not able to really usefully summarize them for you. Yeah.
I think this is an opportunity for comment based on the comments.
Right.
I don't think we had any particular outcome other than we need to move forward with where we're going with respect to the certification and inference. And I think it's much as it was a year ago when we started this, everybody wants something, they want inference, but they're not sure what they're asking for with inference. So,
I mean, to be honest with you, Mr. President, I had, or committee chair, I had anticipated that the committee might provide some direction on some individual concepts, but not that we would, sort of go through line by line and vote. I don't know what utility there is for this smaller subset to vote on particular language, because obviously the board has to make that decision. But you could make recommendations about particular language, or give direction to staff to redraft in certain areas, or to give you options in different areas, or it's up to you how you want to direct your staff to use its time.
And perhaps one thing that I can offer is that we can take the existing language, provide the comments below each one of the sections, so that you can relate them back. But there's a general feel you've got to have for inference in general anyway. It's easy to say, should a case be 48 units? Should it be defined in the first place? Should it be 100 units? Where do you go there? Should you allow inbound? Should you treat it differently on the inbound versus outbound? There's a whole, and then what if it's sealed? What if it's not homogeneous? And then down to the tote level, because we've gotten comments this time in the recent couple of weeks on the actual totes where the wholesaler's packing the tote, it goes to a whole pharmacy that then wants to infer. So
yeah, I mean, so I would say that relatively soon, and it doesn't have to be today, obviously, but it's relatively soon, the board needs to make some sorts of decisions about what kinds of aggregate containers it is comfortable applying any sort of inference to, whether that includes pallets, cases, totes, mixed cases, mixed pallets, those kinds of decisions. Because obviously, as we've discussed, each time an inference is applied, that is slightly less than could be required under the law. You know what I mean? That you're not individually scanning each of those units. So, each of those decisions needs to be justified by, some finding or belief by the board that enhances rather than detracts from the overall state of security in the supply chain. That's the sort of finding requirement that's in 4163. So anyway, I think I've said enough on that. But so as Ginny mentioned, several of the comments that we received only came in more recently. So we only now have sort of a complete set of comments, and I anticipate that if we told people they could still submit more comments, there would still be more comments coming in. So I don't know that you could express I think you can express your opinion informally at a board meeting just as easily as you could by way of a recommendation from this committee, in other words.
Did you get a decent amount of response regarding inference that we can draw a conclusion that, there's a relatively large group out there that feels this way?
Well, we've got important comments from associations that represent key players in the supply chain. So in that sense, yes. I think it's one of those things that part of what we're doing right now is we're attempting to pull together comments as part of the pre-regulation stage so that we can get a regulation that fits the desires of the board based on the regulated public as much as we can. Then we release it for public comment, and then we still have to respond to the comments. Depending on where we go, I suspect we'll see some of the comments again. We might see other ones. But this is an attempt to refine the regulation so that it's more meaningful at the front end. Now, time-wise, time is beginning to start playing a little role. If we're not preempted, we're to the stage where we need to kind of aggressively move with respect to inference. I think frankly, personally, I think anyway, then we're in better shape with the drop shipment. But with respect to inference and certification, which are the two main issues right now on this agenda item and the next one, I think the board's got to do some work, and I'm not sure this is the best forum to do it in. We can summarize the comments for you. We can integrate them into the manuscript so that you can see what our regulation would provide. Here's what the various commenters responded to, and put it out there like that so that you can kind of get a feel for where it goes, and then you can maybe take a look at the whole thing, seeing whether or not you've got a regulation that's still cohesive.
And I'll also point out that, remember the genesis of these regulation or this draft language was that, as you pointed out, the board put out several requests for information that didn't really result in the results that the board was hoping for. So these were written somewhat in a vacuum, and as such were written sort of to include all the possible concepts without necessarily intending. It certainly wasn't an intention on my part or the board's part that this concept is necessarily fixed or. And some of the comments, understandably, are reacting to this regulation as if it's a, actual regulatory proposal and sort of taking it down to the line edit point, which is fine, but it just means that some of those concepts still need to be debated among the board members before we're ready for line editing.
That's what the general, that's what the reason why that was drafted is because we weren't getting comments because it's difficult comment on what you didn't have anything to look at and to read. So by putting out draft language, it gave somebody to read it and say, whoa, yay or nay or my comments. So would it be okay if we had instruct board staff to on each paragraph in summary some of the comments and see how much better it makes the draft?
That would be very helpful.
See if we can integrate some of those comments.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard to get that all in one document. We may have to sort of create a packet of things, but somehow.
It'll be linked.
I mean, if we tried to put all of them, you have such a red line document, it would be hard to read. But
yeah, I think probably just as it is, and then some bullet points of what they,
right. And we could sort of say the majority of comments mentioned this topic. 50% of the comments mentioned this topic or whatever.
Assuming that our next meeting is September 26th. So it would be presented, and then we have an October board meeting. So it would be nice if we could
Make some,
get the comments, in some sort of a form where a recommendation by this committee could be made to the board, and then perhaps the board could get some serious work done on inference at our October meeting.
I think you might want to have part of that discussion to get the general consensus of the board and where they're going in July, because otherwise it means that you're almost certainly looking at January unless we do an emergency reg.
Yeah.
Okay. Either schedule another board meeting. I mean, you can also throw another board meeting in the mix. And but I think the board needs to deliberate because, as our counsel just said, the language was presented to this committee in March. We brought it to the board in April, but we haven't really discussed it in any great length. And so for us to get a feel for where the board's going, it's difficult to tell. And so we can lay out the comments. The board can discuss them for the direction at the September meeting to start pulling it together. And
Okay.
I mean, my main concern is I want to have my perspective, to the extent I have one, have as little effect on the regulation that's formed as possible, and that it'd be the board in consultation with the industry that decides this. So I don't want to rewrite the reg based on comments without getting direction from the board as to what the board
I don't think it's needed. I think you had a great starting point, and we equally had some very solid comments. And so it wouldn't put you through the task of rewriting it again for it to be picked at. I think we could get value from the comments and integrate it. And if we have at the July board meeting to give a stronger direction for the committee to go, then we can vet that out in September.
well, there are only 5 pages really to look at, really only 4 pages full of text. It's kind of dense text. It's single space dense text. But I think it would be beneficial to us in terms of crafting a meaningful reg to get kind of a feel from the board as well as general based on the kind of comments we've got.
Okay, now you're talking about this text here.
Yeah, plus the comments.
Integrated in below.
So I think what Jenny's saying is the total of the comments, I mean the text with sort of pointers or identifiers about what kinds of comments we received on various sections could probably be done in no more than 10 pages or something,
Yeah. So it's doable that way, and I think it gives you a more comprehensive document to work from. This is, as Josh says, this is a little difficult to work with like this.
Also, can we?
Sure.
Great.
That'll probably be the other
But we might
topics
want
too.
to ask. We have a number of people that.
Certification and thing to inspection as well. But
Before we leave the topic, though, I know we've got a lot of people that travel across the country to be here, so I think
that's why I'm going to go to the inference piece. Any more questions on inference from the board? And have an opportunity for the public to make some comments on an inference as we start to solidify the writing of the regs. Come on up.
You're chairing this thing. The intent, though, is to use the comments we've got. We've had comments offline, and we've had meetings with many of you in smaller groups. And so we kind of have a general feel where some of you are coming from. But if there's something that people would like to say generally, I think it's for the most part, we're hearing that people want inference. Some of you want things other than and far broader than maybe we may want to go as a board, because inference basically undoes the unit serialization piece. So that's going to be the friction I think that we're going to have. And then we've got the certification piece, which is also going to be a little bit problematic potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's most useful to think of inference as essentially a subpart of certification, because it's to what extent is your certification, does it reflect any inference that you may have?
And to answer some of the question on the downline users, if you have inference but you can't really, I put it kind of like a evidence chain of command of evidence. If you're trying to prosecute somebody, at the crime scene, who picked it up from CSI? Was it sealed? Who transported it to the lab? Who did the analysis? Who from where? Then who had it hand off to so and so? Had to hand off to so and so, and you can validate each step. then you can say at the pharmacy, then inspector goes to, it was here in every step of the way. Now it shows up in your pharmacy. That's where the problem is. Or it showed up that, it was here all the way up to the, wholesaler. Well, the manufacturer sent it to a central distribution center. That's been validated. It's been sent to the West Coast distributor. Now it's in your warehouse. In order to isolate that, in fact, was good all the way up to that point. If it's too loose of an inference, you have no stance to stand by how that fake unit got into the medication line. So that I think that's why the inference is needed, but it's also a very important piece of maintaining the integrity. So no more comments on inference? Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to.
Can I just as someone who, needs this kind of input in order to effectively draft regulations, I would just like to express my gratitude to those who did take the time to submit detailed and very helpful comments on all of these subject areas.
Again, there is comments on our website, so if you want to read those over too, and if that doesn't capture what your thoughts are, please share it with us still. We'll go with number 9, discussion concerning possible regulation requirements on the certification process that's needed in the California e-Pedigree law, and that's going to be attachment.
With this, is there any reason why we can't pass this? Question of those of us that are here.
You mean as drafted, or I think the same thing applies, maybe to a lesser extent, but still applies. We did receive comments, both substantive and line edit as to certification. I think the largest issue that the board needs to resolve is what is the party that is certifying by way of that certification. In other words, to what level of information are they verifying or confirming as true and correct for the next recipient of that product. So just think about that for purposes of the board's discussion in July. But I agree that within those, this might have narrower parameters of discussion than the inference one does. It's not quite as wide-ranging, so it may be more possible to move it along.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be as much,
right,
as the
you could certainly prepare the same document as to comments that were received on certification.
Yeah, so it'll be the same recommendation to board staff. Any other questions from the committee? How about from the public on certification? Okay, so then that goes to
Drop shipments.
Drop shipments. Do they have some proposed language? Do you want to handle this one, Jen? Or?
I can do it if you want. Whatever you want. Well, Mr. Valencia might want to represent himself here, but I will just say that he's standing up. He's making himself known. So you look at him, looking all important back there.
That'll teach you to come to a public meeting.
Yeah, he looks good. You look good, John. Anyway, the proposal from Mr. Valencia on behalf of, I think, one or more of his clients would, the board has struggled with for some time what to do about drop shipments, and has not, at least at the April meeting and the March meeting, has not reflected a high level of satisfaction with the presentations or answers that they've gotten as to how this might be fashioned. There are sort of 2 different columns into which I would place ways to approach drop shipment.
Yeah.
Or three. No, option number 1 would be not treat them any differently and require that you have, full pedigrees for all drop shipments. Option number 2 would be to still require pedigrees to be reflective of all owners of a drug for a drop shipment, but somehow allow for either time tolerances or paperwork tolerances that would somehow better accommodate the pedigree requirements to the logistics of how drop shipments are actually handled in the supply chain presently. And then the third column would be what I would call the exemption column, and which that's primarily what Mr. Valencia is representing here, which is that anyone who's not involved in physical handling of a drug doesn't have pedigree appending requirements, doesn't have to be reflected, or doesn't have to certify their participation in the pedigree transaction.
But only for a drop shipment.
Right, but only for drop shipment. And the drop shipment is defined. Yeah, that one of the difficulties that we ran up against in the March meeting was that some of the participants in that meeting were talking about drop shipment in a way that's broader than what the statute says in California. Statute in California is very specific and very limited to only apply to transactions that have those three characteristics that are in 4163.1, one of which are shipments directly from a manufacturer to a pharmacy or other dispenser. So that's a much more limited category than what might be the whole universe of drop shipments that are taking place in the supply chain. Yeah. You never have to raise your hands, Chad.
Okay, then. And so,
Give 'em the
in
gavel.
Exhibit A of drop ship distribution process, any potential regulation should.
Use your microphone. Can you?
Sorry, you want that? Any potential regulations that should ensure that entities who never physically handle the product are not subject to the reporting requirements. This will allow manufacturers to maintain important efficiencies in their distribution system. And I agree with that. The drop ship system has been around for a long time. It goes usually directly from the manufacturer either to the pharmacy or the manufacturer to the practitioner for patient use. And so, in the event that, and John, maybe you're going to have to help me with this as well as Josh, in the event that there has been some product sent to a clinic or whatever, and the clinic decides that there is no need for it after it has received it, and it returns it back to, I mean, my thought is it goes back to the manufacturer, not to the wholesaler, and it reverses the whole process as far as the paper trail. The wholesaler has it has gone from the manufacturer to the clinic, and it is billed by the wholesaler.
Well, it depends on what model you're looking at.
Well,
if you're looking at an exemption, there's no paperwork in the first place.
Well, no, there's still paperwork. I think
The
right.
pedigree has not been generated.
Well, no, there's still a pedigree. I mean, well, John can talk. This is one of the difficulties I'm having with this particular provision, and I want to be careful that what I'm expressing is not at all a policy position. I'm just from a sort of logistics and legal drafting point of view, I'm not sure how this particular proposal as written would operate, in the sense that I think my brain would at least understand it better if what we were talking about was creating specific exemptions under specific circumstances. To have this sort of broader exemption that anyone not involved in physical handling has the virtue of simplicity and the virtue of, only taking one paragraph. But I'm just not sure what that would mean. So let's take, for instance, your classic drop shipment situation where a manufacturer is shipping to a clinic for whatever, for emergency need, whatever, for next day use. So what we've been consistently told is the clinic, or let's call it pharmacy, just for ease of use, the pharmacy contacts its wholesaler, and the wholesaler, or it might contact the manufacturer directly, but more likely it'll contact its wholesaler. The wholesaler will tell the manufacturer to ship directly. The manufacturer will ship directly. The product will be dispensed before any invoices are generated by anyone, and the wholesaler will never take possession of the property, of the drug, although it will have documents showing that it took an intermediate ownership between the manufacturer and the pharmacy. So this amendment, this regulation would say that the wholesaler, because it never took physical custody, does not have to ship or receive a pedigree. So I guess what that means is that there would be a pedigree that would show transfer of ownership from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. But what's less clear to me is how is that pedigree going to get to the pharmacy? Because the pharmacy doesn't have a direct electronic connection to the manufacturer, or typically doesn't. So that would have to come through the wholesaler anyway, I think.
Yeah, well, see, I had the same trouble.
So I'm just not sure logistically if this amendment actually is clear enough, or that would get through OAL as providing sufficient clarity, or whatever. I mean, I don't know exactly. I don't know if John wants to comment on that or not, but
yeah.
I mean, I think, to the extent board members are supportive of it, it is possible to write a regulation that would exempt anyone who doesn't physically handle product from being reflected on the pedigree. I'm not sure we want to say that entity doesn't still have responsibilities for receiving pedigrees and moving them along. That to me is two separate questions, but I don't know if John has a comment on that.
I have several comments. First of all, John Valencia here representing Takeda. And Millennium, its oncology company, which is a specialty company, and that, to go back to the origins of the statute, many of us having worked on it, that's really what this provision accommodates, and perhaps it is the simplicity that's troubling. With all due respect to the prior meetings, our particular business model is disassociated from the many elements of the many different other kinds of wholesale distribution intervention in the ordinary business model. Based on the statute, I don't see any special treatment for them. Apropos of what went before today, that's a different law.
Right.
And in order to accommodate much of what you saw at the Orange County meeting, you'd need different statutory provisions. Our proposal finds itself in two buckets, number 1 and number 3. We are prepared as a manufacturer, and as I suspect many other specialty manufacturers are, we're going to originate the pedigree. And since pharmacy and other dispensers ultimately, several years down the road, will be linked into the pedigree system, eventually they will receive directly from the manufacturer a scalable, readable, interoperable pedigree on an electronic basis. Maybe not in the initial years, but we're going to originate it. Apropos of the conversation just a few minutes ago in the proposed FAQs. We're going to originate it. And when it's ready to be read by an oncology clinic, an oncologist's office, a specialty pharmacy that receives and redistributes, which is already accommodated in California law, the balance of that accountability will be there. So Millennium in no way proposes, even though the statute says that the regs can accommodate alternative process, we're really not suggesting in our draft an alternative process. We simply want to clarify that our intermediaries aren't obligated to do something that the statute, which you pointed out correctly, has very specific criteria, for all intents and purposes, does exempt them from that compliance. We just wanted it to be clear. But from our perspective, we're moving towards compliance with the two provisions of 1115 and 1116.
So I don't know your client's business, and so this is the first time I've heard that anyone is that optimistic that there are going to be direct manufacturer to pharmacy connections that would enable passage of pedigree to go directly from manufacturer to pharmacy anywhere in the next year or two. You know what I mean? Like that anytime prior to 20.
But under the statute, eventually, what choice does anybody have?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So, and that's really,
That's
really the object.
Right.
It's on a phased-in basis,
Right.
but you all have articulated throughout the course of the afternoon where we're headed.
2017.
Right, but here's my larger question, or my sort of, the law requires that wholesalers, aside from the pedigree portion of the law requires that wholesalers receive records of keep and maintain all records of acquisition and disposition for inspection by the Board of Pharmacy. So, and we've said that for 3PLs, they are required to receive, even though they're not having a change of ownership, they're required to receive something that shows from whom they received that product from the manufacturer. So in other words, the first stage of the pedigree would be transmitted to them, even though they're not on it.
May I interrupt just quickly?
Sure.
Receive in what fashion, then?
Well, that's what, I mean, that's, so my question is.
That's where this particular statutory provision deviates from
Okay.
the whole of e-Pedigree and the normal distribution scheme.
Okay, so
There
you're.
contemplate, in the larger scheme, it contemplates both physical and legal possession. That's what wholesale
I guess,
distributors
wouldn't it
do.
be easier to write this regulation the converse of the way you've written it, which is to essentially say, for those transactions where a manufacturer ships directly to a clinic or an ultimate dispenser or administrator.
The pharmacy or other person authorized by law to dispense or
Right,
administer.
whatever. Don't be so precise. And the intermediate wholesaler's only role is, financial or the intermediate wholesaler doesn't take physical possession of the property. Would it be easier to say affirmatively, in those circumstances, it is sufficient for the pedigree to travel directly from the manufacturer to the dispenser, as opposed to this language that says anyone who doesn't physically handle? Because I feel like I'm just worried about understanding consequences of this.
We have no particular exclusive pride of authorship.
Okay.
Our point since March and today now 20 months and some change until 1/1/15 has been to get this process moving forward.
Okay.
It is the board's prerogative, and we'll certainly provide extensive input as a interested party. But we want to see a body of language moving forward by recommendation from this entity to the full board to begin. There'll be ample public comment period, both in the draft stage, the work stage, and then ultimately the formal reg stage. I don't disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love the opportunity to see it scriven, send it back to our guys, and could very well be that they endorse that wholeheartedly as an alternative. This was their initial approach. I think, as a matter of construct, it accomplishes the same thing, but rather than give you a definitive response right now, we would just like to get a matter moving forward.
But what I would suggest for this committee, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of like your wording, only because it's a little bit more specific.
Right.
And it kind of weeds out unintended consequences, hopefully, but it still meets the criteria.
Right. I mean, I think that what this committee needs to decide, or what the board needs to ultimately decide, is, do you support the concept of creating this, or reinforcing, as John would say, this exemption for this circumstance, a complete exemption from pedigree as opposed to some kind of modified pedigree. Not exempt, an exemption from the wholesaler for participation in the pedigree, not an exemption of the pedigree requirement, but an exemption of the wholesaler's participation in that pedigree.
In this specific business model.
John? So working backwards from me now.
Sure.
So it's an oncological product, and it's at a clinic, and it hasn't been used, or it's expired, and they want to return it. Well, what is that process? Is it the exact reverse?
It is exactly reverse.
It goes back to the manufacturer.
Yeah.
It goes back to the manufacturer, and the wholesaler takes care of the
They
paperwork.
handle the paperwork, they handle the chargeback, they take care of that processing. That's exactly right.
So it should directly back to the manufacturer.
But I also don't think that requires, that's not what we're talking about here, because we're only talking about drop shipment, because the reason that drop shipment required special treatment in the view of the legislature was the time-sensitive nature of the practice. For returns, you're not going to have that same.
Right. I mean, they're expired.
There you could send it to the wholesaler and send it back to the manufacturer.
You'll have the tracking and tracing aspect.
Exactly.
I mean, it's going to vary from company to company, but at least in our experience, and in my personal experience working with a variety of manufacturers, more often than not, it's a direct shot back to the manufacturer.
That was my expectation.
You have very limited volume. You have volatile products. I mean, really, well beyond oncology, you have hemophilia products.
Yeah, well, whatever.
A variety of specialty medications, and they go back because they need to be reconciled.
My curiosity
Josh's observation is correct. Once delivery is effectuated and you've had e-Pedigree compliance, and in the scenario of expiration or non-use, whatever that is, it could go back upstream almost any way, but as a business model matter, it's typically direct back.
But I can see that situation, though, because the wholesaler still technically owns the product, even though never possessed it.
Right.
At the point of return, where does it go? Instead of the manufacturer, back to the wholesaler that owns it. So I just see that if we can address that one last piece, what do you do with a return that the patient died, or for whatever reason the drug is not used by the practitioner? We just need to deal with that one situation.
Here's our pledge. If for example, Josh's working draft was published, we're going to comment on it and contribute to that.
Okay.
Our objective is really to get a proposal or some work product moving forward because the clock is ticking. And this particular committee has quite a period of time between today's activity and the next time it will convene.
My
And
concern
we know you have
is,
multiple priorities, but obviously for a company that is a specialty company, this is a highest priority.
there would be no documentation of the wholesaler owning it with regards to the pedigree if it were returned to the wholesaler. So manufacturer to end user to wholesaler. Well, there's a void there from the initial sale.
Well, there's still going to be invoice documentation. There's still going to be a normal paper documentation.
I know, but now it's been presented into
But
the
see, I think
supply chain.
I think in that instance, it no longer fits the statutory exemption,
Right.
the special treatment.
Okay.
So when product flow deviates from the special carve-out for specialty medications, it's going to have to follow a norm. So in many respects, there'll be an incentive to stick with the purest business model and get that product straight back to the manufacturer. No one will want more e-Pedigree obligations than they have to have.
I just want to say briefly, I'm in support of what you presented, but I like Josh's language. But I think we should also address the issue of how it goes back upstream. And I'm really fine-tuning that because I can see where there can be some issues with that.
Maybe one sentence.
We're happy to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Any other comments from the board?
I guess the remnant question on my end is I think I've heard the senses. Will there be some sort of an action?
I believe this committee will make a recommendation to the board at this July meeting, is my guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very
January.
Thank you all very much.
Reg goes
Very
there.
much appreciated.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you for being persistent.
And so, a comment from the public.
Well, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Angela Blanchard on behalf of HDMA. Just want to echo John Valencia's comments that we too support moving forward in adopting this language, and we are open to Josh's suggestions about creating an inverse or moving the language around, but we too are very concerned about the timing and are eager to move forward.
The inference piece is particularly troubling. We might get an extra board meeting in here.
Maybe be able to be heard in July.
Not inference. This one could go, well, the earliest you could do is release it for public comment as a reg in July.
Right, but I mean, I think that would be enough to provide some comfort to John's clients that the board.
We still got the
To
issue
the
of the
public.
inference and the certification.
So this will probably be heard in July. And then,
It will be brought to the board to release for rulemaking.
yep. On that, where are we?
That's it.
That leaves us with any additional general discussion, questions, comments, to be heard, not to be discussed, but just for potential questions, concerns that may be agendized for a future board or committee meeting. Anything from the public?
We got
Come on down, we got one. I believe it's David Holness. Stole your thunder, but you can restate your name and company.
Sure. David Holness, I'm the president and CEO of PharmaDocs. And PharmaDocs is a market research firm, done some work with large manufacturers and with the FDA several years ago with the implementation of DailyMed, which is a online database of package information, the PI, that actually got moved out of being an analog form into being a digital form, for the use of patients, physicians, et cetera. That's kind of my back door, if you will, into the pharmaceutical arena. At that time, I was working in industry, worked for IBM, worked for Xerox for a number of years in the space as a solutions provider. The point I wanted to make today really dealt with the idea of using authentication as a means by which to close some of the gaps that seem to exist, particularly with track and trace in terms of getting information backwards into the chain. Perhaps perspective, but not only auditing, but just in terms of an outside independent way of validating that the product that was propagated from point A, say, to point B is actually what arrived at point D. Now, this is in no way to deter from track and trace, which obviously is very necessary from a logistics standpoint. But the gaps that seem to exist in track and trace to actually test the item itself, if you think about it, something could be incorrectly packaged at the manufacturer, make its way all the way through and be dispensed to a patient without being known. In fact, going through this thing on rails.
Right.
Yeah, and it would also address things like misfills at the pharmacy. And so the idea that I'm working on, granted at this point it's a concept, but we do have some of the pieces put together and really wanted to kind of test it, obviously with the board, and test it in California because you guys are like ground zero.
Yes, much torture, man.
I believe you. We're trying to trace. Yeah, and we had several conversations about this, and I appreciate the opportunity for you that you've given me to really speak about it. I think it's a way to have an independent process, actually go back and say, yes, all these things that were supposed to have happened because what left the manufacturer is in fact what's arriving at the dispenser. And so all the other things that took place in there, if they line up and that SNI matches the signature of the drug, for lack of a better definition at this point, then you're golden, right? And so that's some of where my thought process is with this, kind of as an outsider to your industry, but having worked in this field from a vendor standpoint, knowing something about technologies, I just wanted to lend that perspective if it's helpful. If it's not, I won't be back.
Again, we can't make any comment at this time.
Understood.
There certainly is something that we can discuss for a possible future agenda item.
Well, I appreciate the board's time. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the public? Anything from the committee? With that, thank you very much for today's meeting. I think we're going forward. It's a very important product. It's been on the plate for a long time, but you're seeing some fruit being bared on a tree. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.